The crystal chandeliers of the Oakhead Country Club cast a warm golden glow over the private dining room, but I had never felt colder. I stood near the edge of the long mahogany table, subtly smoothing the fabric of my understated navy dress. It was a simple piece purchased off the rack, intentionally chosen, so I would not outshine the guest of honor. My sister Chloe sat at the center of the room, radiating an almost aggressive perfection. Her hair was styled into flawless cascading waves, and the massive 3-carat diamond on her left hand seemed to catch every available beam of light in the room. This was her engagement dinner, a calculated merger between our family who desperately clung to the image of black excellence, and the Sterlings, a white family whose generational wealth was woven into the very foundation of the city. I had not wanted to come. For years I had kept my distance from my family's toxic orbit, speaking to them only on major holidays and maintaining a quiet, independent life. But my father Carlton had called me 3 times the previous week, using his signature blend of guilt and obligation to secure my attendance. "We need a united front, Zora," he had insisted. "The Sterlings are traditional. They need to see that we are a close-knit, supportive family. Do not embarrass us by being absent." So I showed up expecting the usual passive-aggressive remarks and subtle slights. I was not prepared for a public execution. We were barely through the appetizer course when Julian, Chloe's fiancé, leaned back in his chair and smiled expansively. He had that particular kind of ease that only comes from never having to worry about a bill in your entire life. Julian's father, Richard Sterling, sat quietly at the head of the table nursing a glass of bourbon. Richard was a formidable man, a billionaire real estate developer and philanthropist whose foundation was famous across the state. Julian gestured toward me with his wineglass. "So, Zora," he drawled, his voice carrying easily over the soft jazz playing in the background. "Chloe tells me you are still finding yourself. What is it you are doing these days?" Before I could even open my mouth to answer, my mother Vivica jumped in. Her manicured hand waved dismissively in my direction. "Oh, Julian dear, let us not bore your father with Zora's little struggles." She turned to Richard with a bright, artificial smile. "This is my other daughter. She cleans floors for a living." The silence that followed was immediate and suffocating. The clinking of silverware stopped. Waiters hovering near the walls seemed to freeze. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a familiar burning sensation that I had spent my entire life trying to suppress. My father chuckled, taking a slow sip of his champagne. "Every family has got one, Richard. You know how it is? You try to give them the best, but some apples fall a little far from the tree." I stood there, my hands clasped tightly in front of me, absorbing the humiliation. The truth, the actual reality of my life, was far more complex than their cruel summary. When I was 20 years old, I was enrolled in the highly competitive pre-med program at a prestigious historically black university, exactly as my parents had demanded. They had mapped out my entire existence. I was supposed to be Dr. Zora, a gleaming trophy they could display to their country club friends. But the sterile hospital environments and endless biology textbooks drained my soul. My true passion, my absolute calling, was historic preservation. I loved the tangible history of old buildings, the physical labor of restoring forgotten architecture, breathing life back into spaces that the world had abandoned. When I finally summoned the courage to change my major and pursue preservation work, the fallout was catastrophic. Vivica and Carlton did not just express disappointment, they completely cut me off. They withdrew my tuition funding mid-semester, packed up my childhood bedroom, and told me that if I wanted to do manual labor like a peasant, I could do it on my own dime. Since that day, I had scrubbed floors, stripped lead paint, and sanded century-old hardwood just to pay my rent and survive. I had sacrificed everything for my passion. And now, 15 years later, my mother was using that painful history as a punchline to elevate her golden child. Chloe leaned forward, a sickeningly sweet smile plastered across her face. She reached into her designer clutch and pulled out a leather-bound folio, the catering bill for the entire engagement dinner. She slid it across the smooth wood of the table, stopping right in front of my plate. "Since you are eating our food and embarrassing our family's image in front of my future in-laws," Chloe sneered, her voice low but sharp enough to cut glass. "Consider this your entry fee." Pay the bill, Zora. It is the least you can do. I glanced down at the paper. The total was $15,000. It was an astronomical sum for a single dinner, a deliberate, calculated attempt to break me. Chloe knew exactly what she was doing. She wanted me to panic, to cry, to beg our parents for help in front of the Sterlings, proving once and for all that I was the pathetic dependent failure they claimed I was. Julian burst into laughter, resting his arm casually over the back of Chloe's chair. You know, Zora, he added, his smirk widening, my family's commercial properties go through a ton of janitorial supplies. If things are really that tight with your little floor cleaning hustle, I can probably get you a solid discount on mops. Just let my assistant know. The cruelty was breathtaking. My mother offered a delicate, tinkling laugh, as if Julian had just delivered a brilliant comedic punchline. My father nodded in agreement. I did not cry. I had shed all my tears over these people a decade ago. I simply looked at Chloe, then at Julian, and finally at my parents. The sheer absurdity of their arrogance washed over me, leaving behind a cold, absolute calm. I slowly reached into my small purse to retrieve my wallet. I was fully prepared to drop my black titanium corporate card on the table and pay the ridiculous $15,000 bill without batting an eye. I was ready to watch their smug faces contort in confusion. But before my fingers could even touch the metal edge of my card, a sudden harsh sound shattered the dining room's atmosphere. Richard Sterling had stood up. The scrape of Richard's heavy wooden chair against the marble floor echoed like a gunshot. The entire table went dead silent. Julian's laughter died in his throat. Chloe's smug smile froze. My mother Vivica sat up completely straight, her eyes darting nervously toward the billionaire patriarch. Richard did not look at my mother. He did not look at my father. He completely ignored his son and his future daughter-in-law. His intense, piercing gaze was locked entirely on me. More specifically, he was staring at my hands. When I had reached for my purse, my left hand had turned upward under the bright light of the chandelier, exposing the deep, pale crescent-shaped scar that carved a violent path across my palm. It was an old injury healed, but stark, a permanent physical reminder of a night that had changed the trajectory of my entire life. The silence stretched on thick and suffocating. The ambient noise of the country club outside our private room seemed to fade away completely. I stood frozen, my hand still resting near the clasp of my purse, suddenly highly conscious of the billionaire's scrutiny. Richard Sterling was not a man who displayed emotion lightly. He was known in the business world for his stoic, unreadable demeanor. But right now, his face was a portrait of absolute shock, rapidly shifting into intense calculation. He stared at the scar, then lifted his eyes to meet mine. "Could I speak with you outside?" he demanded. His tone was not a request. It was an absolute command that left no room for argument. Panic instantly flooded my mother's face. The carefully orchestrated evening was derailing in front of her eyes. "Oh, Richard, please," Vivica said, her voice climbing an octave higher than normal. She stood up quickly, nearly knocking over her wine glass. "You do not need to trouble yourself with Zora. She is just leaving. We have so much more to discuss about the wedding venues, and Chloe has prepared a lovely toast." Richard ignored her completely. His eyes never left my face. "Outside." Now he repeated. He bypassed his son, stepped away from the table, and headed directly toward the heavy glass doors that led to the private outdoor terrace. I took a breath, letting go of my purse, and began to follow him. Before I could take 3 steps, Julian slid his chair back and moved to block my path. He stood tall, chest puffed out, using his physical size to intimidate me. The affable, joking, rich boy facade was gone, replaced by a defensive, aggressive glare. "Listen to me very carefully," Julian muttered, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper meant only for my ears. "I do not know what kind of game you are playing, or what kind of sob story you are planning to feed my father to get a handout. But you need to know your place. Get your things and get out of here before you ruin my night." I looked at Julian. I looked at the tailored suit paid for by a trust fund, the expensive watch bought with unearned wealth, the absolute entitlement radiating from every pore of his body. I thought about the $15,000 bill sitting on the table behind me. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply stepped around him, moving with a quiet, deliberate grace that left him standing foolishly in the middle of the room. I walked straight toward the terrace doors, leaving my mother sputtering apologies to the empty air, leaving my father gripping his napkin in silent rage, and leaving Chloe staring after me with wide, panicked eyes. I pushed open the glass doors and stepped out into the humid Atlanta night. The terrace was deserted, softly illuminated by wrought iron lanterns. Beyond the stone balustrade, the sprawling green lawns of the golf course vanished into the darkness. Richard Sterling was waiting for me near the edge of the balcony. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out over the grounds. As he heard the door click shut behind me, he turned around. The harsh lighting from the dining room spilled onto the terrace, casting long shadows across his face. "Show me your hand," he said. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, then raised my left hand, turning my palm upward. The crescent scar caught the light. It was jagged, running from the base of my thumb down toward my wrist. Richard stepped closer, his eyes tracing the line of the scar without touching me. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice low, vibrating with an intensity I did not understand. "I got it working," I said simply, keeping my voice steady. "I told you I do manual labor." "That is not just a work injury," Richard said, his gaze snapping up to meet mine. "That is a structural compression tear. You get a scar exactly like that when a tension cable snaps and you try to hold a load-bearing beam with your bare hands." My heart gave a sudden violent thud against my ribs. I stared at him, completely taken aback. How could he possibly know that the injury had happened over a decade ago? It was the hardest, most dangerous night of my early career. I had been working as an anonymous apprentice on a massive, highly sensitive restoration project. The scaffolding had given way, a tension cable had snapped, and I had quite literally used my own body weight and my bare hands to prevent a historic ceiling beam from collapsing and destroying a century-old structural foundation. The steel cable had ripped through my protective gloves and sliced my palm open to the muscle. "You are the one," Richard whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "It was you. You are the apprentice who saved the Auburn Avenue estate." I froze. The Auburn Avenue estate was one of the most significant pieces of Black history in Atlanta. 15 years ago, it had been slated for demolition until a massive anonymous grant funded its complete restoration. The project had been shrouded in secrecy to protect the historic site from vandals during the construction phase. I had poured my blood, sweat, and tears into that building. "How do you know about Auburn Avenue?" I asked my guard, instantly going up. "Because my foundation funded the restoration," Richard said, his voice tightening with a mixture of awe and rising anger. "I poured $4 million into saving that property, and I was told the brilliant teenage apprentice who identified the structural rot, the one who nearly lost her hand saving the main sanctuary beam, was your sister Chloe." The night air suddenly felt incredibly thin. I could not breathe. "Chloe." I repeated the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. "Yes," Richard said, his jaw clenching. "Your parents brought Chloe to my office 10 years ago. They showed me the architectural blueprints. They showed me the safety reports. They told me Chloe was a prodigy who had secretly worked on the site. I was so incredibly moved by her dedication to her heritage that I created the Sterling Heritage Scholarship specifically for her. I paid for her entire undergraduate degree and her entire medical school tuition based on that achievement." My stomach plummeted. The room started to spin. 10 years ago, my parents had claimed that Chloe had won a massive private philanthropic scholarship for her pre-med studies. They had thrown a huge party. They had bragged about it to everyone in their social circle. I had been scrubbing floors in a local diner to pay for my own classes at the time. They had stolen my work. They had stolen my physical pain, my blood, my dedication to historic preservation, and handed it to my sister to fund her medical career. Before I could even process the magnitude of the betrayal, the glass doors behind us burst open. Vivica and Carlton rushed out onto the terrace. My mother looked frantic, her eyes wide with terror as she saw Richard and me standing so close together. Carlton's face was a mask of furious desperation. "Richard, please," Vivica cried out, practically running across the stone patio. She grabbed my arm violently, trying to pull me away from the billionaire. "I apologize for Zora. She is not well. She makes things up. I am sure she is bothering you with her little stories." Richard looked at my mother, his expression turning to absolute ice. "She was not telling stories, Vivica. We were discussing her scar." My mother's grip on my arm tightened like a vice, her nails digging into my skin. "Oh, that." She let out a loud, shrill laugh that echoed terribly in the quiet night. "She got that scar falling off a bicycle when she was a teenager. She is incredibly clumsy." Chloe, on the other hand, she turned toward the dining room doors, gesturing wildly. "Chloe is our miracle worker. Chloe is the one who saved the historic church. That is why you gave Chloe the Sterling Heritage Scholarship, remember?" Because of her brilliant architectural mind, my father stepped forward, trying to block Richard's view of me. "Exactly, Richard. Chloe is the star of this family. Zora just dropped out of school and cleans floors. You shouldn't waste your time talking to her." Richard Sterling did not move. He looked at my parents, then looked back at me. He was a billionaire who had survived in the cutthroat world of commercial real estate for 40 years. He knew when he was being lied to. He knew when a hustle was being run. And right now he was looking at two parents who were sweating through their expensive clothes. "I see," Richard said smoothly, though his eyes were completely devoid of warmth. "Well, Vivica, since Chloe has such a brilliant architectural mind, let's test that theory right now." He stepped past my parents and walked back into the dining room. I followed him, my parents trailing behind us like panicked children. The entire table was still silent, watching the drama unfold. Chloe sat frozen in her seat, her engagement ring suddenly looking very heavy on her finger. Julian looked back and forth between his father and me, clearly sensing that a massive shift in power was occurring. Richard stopped at the head of the table. He leaned his hands on the mahogany wood and stared directly at his future daughter-in-law. "Chloe," Richard said, his voice carrying the lethal authority of a corporate boardroom executioner. "Since you were the lead structural consultant on the Auburn Avenue estate restoration, I have a quick question for you. A technical curiosity I have wondered about for years." Chloe swallowed hard. The color completely drained from her perfect face. Her eyes darted to my mother, seeking help, but Vivica was completely frozen. "Yes, Mr. Sterling," Chloe managed to whisper. When the western sanctuary wall began to buckle under the weight of the water damage, Richard asked, his eyes narrowing, "What was the exact mathematical pressure point calculation you used to determine the angle of the temporary steel cabling? And more importantly, why did you choose a dynamic tension rig over a static support beam?" The silence in the dining room became absolute. It was a highly complex, specific architectural problem. It was the exact problem I had stayed up for 4 nights straight solving when I was 19 years old, sitting on the floor of my cheap apartment, surrounded by historic blueprints. Chloe stared at Richard. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at Julian, her eyes begging him to intervene, but Julian was just staring at her, waiting for the answer. She looked down at her hands. "I do not remember the exact numbers off the top of my head. I think we used a static beam because it was stronger." She phrased it as a question. It was the wrong answer. It was a fatally wrong answer. Richard did not say a word to her. He slowly turned his head and looked at me. I stood tall at the edge of the room. I ignored my mother's frantic, silent gesturing. I ignored my father's threatening glare. I looked directly at the billionaire and spoke in a clear, unwavering voice. "A static support beam would have caused a catastrophic failure." I said, the technical knowledge flowing from my lips as easily as breathing. The historic masonry of the western wall was composed of 19th century lime mortar, which has a compressive strength of barely 200 pounds per square inch. A static beam would have created rigid stress points, causing the weakened brickwork to shatter under lateral pressure. I used a dynamic tension rig calculated at a 45-degree angle, distributed across 3 secondary load-bearing columns, because it allowed the building to naturally settle and shift during the drying process without snapping the primary joists. The exact tension calculation was 4,250 pounds of pressure per square inch. I finished speaking. The jazz music played softly in the background. Richard Sterling slowly stood up straight. He looked at my parents. He looked at Chloe, who was now trembling in her seat. Then he looked back at me. His face was a mask of cold, terrifying realization. He had not just been lied to. He had been actively financially defrauded out of $250,000 by the people sitting at this table. And my family, the people who had called me a floor cleaner and a failure, realized in that exact moment that their golden child's entire future was currently resting in the scarred palm of my hand. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the Oakhead Country Club and stepped out into the humid Atlanta night. The air felt thick and heavy, with the scent of jasmine and the undeniable tension spilling out from the private dining room behind me. Richard Sterling was already waiting near the edge of the stone balustrade. He did not bother looking out over the manicured green lawns of the golf course. His sharp and calculating gaze remained locked entirely on me as the heavy doors clicked shut. "Show me your hand," he commanded. His voice held the kind of absolute authority that controlled boardrooms and broke corporate rivals. I did not hesitate. I raised my left hand and turned my palm upward. The ambient light from the dining room windows caught the thick crescent-shaped scar that carved a jagged path from the base of my thumb straight down to my wrist. For a moment, the only sound was the distant hum of the country club jazz band. Richard stepped closer. He did not reach out to touch the skin, but his eyes traced the jagged line with forensic precision. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his tone vibrating with an intensity that sent a sudden chill down my spine. "I got it working," I replied, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "As my mother so graciously announced to your entire family, I do manual labor." "That is not a simple work injury," Richard said, his gaze snapping up to meet mine. "That is a structural compression tear. You get a scar exactly like that when a high-tension steel cable snaps, and you use your bare hands to brace a load-bearing beam to prevent a catastrophic architectural collapse." My heart gave a sudden and violent thud against my ribs. I stared at the billionaire in complete shock. The injury he just described, down to the exact mechanical failure, had happened 15 years ago. It was the most terrifying night of my early career. I had been working as an anonymous apprentice on a highly sensitive and massive restoration project. The scaffolding had given way in the middle of the night. A primary cable snapped, and I had literally thrown my own body weight under a historic ceiling beam to keep a century-old structural foundation from turning to dust. The steel cable had ripped straight through my heavy leather gloves and sliced my palm open to the muscle. "How do you know that?" I asked, my voice dropping to a cautious whisper. "How could you possibly know the structural mechanics of a restoration site accident?" "Because my foundation funded the restoration of the Auburn Avenue estate," Richard said. His voice grew tight, with a mixture of awe and rising fury. "I poured $4 million into saving that property because it is a cornerstone of Black history in this city. I demanded absolute secrecy during the construction phase to protect the site from vandals. I received a private report about an anonymous teenage apprentice who identified the structural rot and nearly lost her hand saving the main sanctuary beam." He paused and took a step closer until I could see the absolute rage burning behind his eyes. "You are the one," he whispered. "You are the apprentice who saved the Auburn Avenue estate." I froze. A sudden and terrible dread pooled in my stomach as Richard continued speaking. 10 years ago, Richard said, his words dropping like heavy stones, "your parents brought Chloe to my private office. They presented your sister as a prodigy. They showed me the architectural blueprints and the structural safety reports. They looked me dead in the eye and told me Chloe was the one who secretly worked on that site and risked her life to save that sanctuary. I was so moved by her dedication to her heritage that I created the Sterling Heritage Scholarship specifically for her. I personally funded $250,000 to pay for her undergraduate degree and her entire medical school tuition based on that exact achievement." The night air suddenly felt incredibly thin. I could not breathe. I could not form a single word. 10 years ago, my parents had thrown a massive celebration for Chloe. They bragged to every person in their elite Atlanta social circle about a private and highly exclusive philanthropic scholarship she had won for her pre-med studies. I had been scrubbing floors in a local diner at that exact same time, trying to scrape together enough cash to pay for my own community college classes after they cut off my tuition. My own parents had stolen my blood and my physical pain and my absolute dedication to historic preservation. They had handed my architectural blueprints to my sister so she could fraudulently finance her medical career. Before the sheer magnitude of that betrayal could fully shatter my composure, the glass doors behind us burst open with a violent crash. My mother, Vivica, rushed out onto the terrace with my father, Carlton, close on her heels. Vivica's face was twisted into a mask of sheer and unadulterated panic. The carefully orchestrated networking dinner was derailing right in front of her eyes, and she was desperate to regain control. "Richard, please," Vivica cried out, practically running across the stone patio. She lunged forward and dug her perfectly manicured acrylic nails brutally into my arm, attempting to yank me away from the billionaire. "I apologize for Zora. She is not well. She makes things up for attention. I am sure she is bothering you with her little stories." Richard looked at my mother, his expression turning to absolute ice. "She was not telling stories, Vivica. We were discussing her scar." My mother's grip on my arm tightened like a vice, her nails breaking my skin. "Oh, that?" She let out a loud and shrill laugh that echoed terribly against the stone walls. "She got that ugly scar falling off a bicycle when she was a clumsy teenager. She is incredibly unstable, Richard. You really cannot believe a word she says." Vivica turned toward the dining room doors, gesturing wildly back toward the table where Chloe sat. "Chloe, on the other hand, is our miracle worker. Chloe is the brilliant mind who saved the historic church. That is exactly why you gave Chloe the Sterling Heritage Scholarship, remember, because of her exceptional architectural mind and her dedication to our community." My father stepped forward, puffing out his chest to use his physical size to intimidate me into silence. "Exactly, Richard," he said, his voice dripping with forced camaraderie. "Chloe is the star of this family. Zora just dropped out of school and cleans floors for a living. You really should not waste your valuable time talking to someone who refuses to apply herself." Richard Sterling did not move an inch. He was a billionaire who had survived the cutthroat world of commercial real estate for 40 years. He knew when a hustle was being run. He looked at my mother's desperate and sweating face. He looked at my father's aggressive posture. Then he looked through the glass doors at Chloe, who was sitting completely frozen at the dining table, her engagement ring suddenly looking very heavy on her finger. "I see," Richard said smoothly, though his tone was completely devoid of any warmth. "Well, Vivica, since Chloe has such a brilliant architectural mind, let us test that theory right now." Richard turned on his heel and marched directly back toward the dining room. He was ready to demand the truth, leaving my panicked parents scrambling to follow him while I stood on the terrace knowing the explosion was finally here. I followed Richard back into the opulent dining room, the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind me to seal us inside with the rest of the guests. The ambient chatter that had briefly resumed during our absence died instantly. The clinking of silver forks against fine china ceased. Every eye in the room was fixed on the billionaire patriarch as he marched to the head of the long mahogany table. My parents practically tripped over themselves trying to keep up with him, their faces glistening with a cold sweat that ruined their carefully applied country club facades. My mother tugged at her expensive pearl necklace, her breathing shallow and rapid, while my father gripped the back of an empty chair so hard his knuckles turned white. At the center of the table, my sister Chloe sat perfectly still. The radiant, aggressive confidence she had flaunted just moments ago had completely evaporated. She looked like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. Julian sat beside her, swirling his bourbon, completely oblivious to the impending disaster. He looked up at his father with a relaxed, entitled smirk, expecting Richard to announce some grand wedding gift or offer a toast to the happy couple. Instead, Richard placed both of his hands flat on the polished wood of the table and leaned forward. The sheer gravitational pull of his authority commanded absolute silence. Chloe, Richard said, his voice deceptively calm, carrying the lethal precision of a man who destroyed corporate empires before breakfast. "Since you were the lead structural consultant on the Auburn Avenue estate restoration, I have a quick technical question for you. It is a curiosity I have wondered about for years, ever since I signed the final grant approval. Chloe swallowed hard. The remaining color drained from her perfectly contoured cheeks. Her eyes darted wildly toward our mother, silently begging for an intervention, a distraction, any kind of lifeline to pull her out of the spotlight. But my mother was paralyzed, her mouth opening and closing without a single sound escaping. "Yes, Mr. Sterling." Chloe managed to whisper, her voice trembling so badly it sounded like a fragile pane of glass ready to shatter. Richard did not break eye contact. When the western sanctuary wall began to buckle under the weight of the severe water damage, what was the exact mathematical pressure point calculation you used to determine the angle of the temporary steel cabling? And more importantly, why did you choose a dynamic tension rig over a static support beam? The silence that followed was agonizing. It was a highly complex, hyper-specific architectural problem. It was the exact grueling mechanical crisis I had stayed awake for 4 consecutive nights solving when I was 19 years old. I remembered sitting on the bare floor of my cheap apartment, surrounded by historic blueprints, surviving on cheap coffee and sheer adrenaline, desperate to calculate a way to keep a century of Black history from turning into dust. I had lived and breathed those numbers. They were permanently etched into my brain, just like the scar on my hand. Chloe stared at Richard. Her jaw trembled. She reached out and grabbed Julian by the sleeve of his tailored suit jacket, her manicured fingers digging into the expensive fabric. She looked at her fiancé with wide, pleading eyes, desperately hoping the wealthy heir might suddenly possess the architectural knowledge to save her. But Julian just frowned, shrugging his shoulders as he waited for his brilliant bride to dazzle his father. He had no idea how to help her, and he clearly expected her to know the answer. "I do not remember the exact numbers off the top of my head," Chloe stammered, offering a weak, trembling smile that failed to reach her eyes. "I think we used a static support beam because it was the strongest option available at the time." She phrased her answer as a hesitant question. It was the wrong answer. It was a fatally wrong, fundamentally impossible answer that proved she had never set foot on that restoration site. Richard did not say a word to her. He did not yell or correct her. He slowly turned his head away from the golden child and locked his piercing gaze entirely on me. He was waiting. I stood tall at the edge of the dining room. I ignored my mother, who was frantically shaking her head silently, demanding that I keep my mouth shut and protect the family image. I ignored my father, whose eyes burned with a threatening glare that used to terrify me into submission when I was a child. I stepped away from the shadows and moved closer to the table, looking directly at the billionaire. "A static support beam would have caused a catastrophic failure," I said. My voice rang out clear, steady, and unwavering, cutting through the heavy silence of the room. The historic masonry of the Western Wall was composed of 19th century lime mortar. That specific mortar has a compressive strength of barely 200 pounds per square inch. Forcing a rigid static beam against that failing structure would have created concentrated stress points, causing the weakened brickwork to shatter completely under lateral pressure. I took another step forward, the physical memory of that grueling night flooding my senses as the technical knowledge flowed from my lips. I used a dynamic tension rig calculated at a precise 45-degree angle. I continued my gaze, holding Richard firmly. I distributed that tension across 3 secondary load-bearing columns. It was the only viable solution because it allowed the fragile building to naturally settle and shift during the massive industrial drying process without snapping the primary joists. The exact tension calculation was 4,250 pounds of pressure per square inch. I finished speaking and let the silence reclaim the room. The soft jazz music from the overhead speakers seemed to highlight the total devastation left in the wake of my answer. Richard Sterling slowly stood up straight. The casual posture of a dinner guest vanished entirely, replaced by the rigid stance of a man who had just uncovered a massive financial crime. He looked down at Chloe, who was now shrinking into her chair, quiet tears of humiliation ruining her immaculate makeup. Then he turned his attention to my parents. Vivica and Carlton were shrinking back against the wall, their manufactured high society personas completely obliterated. The realization washed over Richard's face, turning his features to absolute stone. He had not just been lied to for the sake of parental pride. He had been actively, financially defrauded. He had been tricked into awarding a $250,000 prestigious heritage scholarship to a complete fraud. He had funded Chloe's entire undergraduate degree and her expensive medical school tuition based on a complete fabrication. My family had stolen my grueling physical labor, my sleepless nights, and my actual blood, simply to finance their favorite daughter's elite lifestyle and boost their own social climbing agenda. Richard stared at my parents with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust, fully comprehending that he was sitting in a room with criminals who had spent a decade robbing their own daughter. The dining room exploded into absolute chaos the second Richard Sterling walked out. My mother started hyperventilating, grabbing her chest and demanding someone fetch her water, while simultaneously cursing my name. My father lunged toward the terrace doors, barking frantic orders at the catering staff to clear the room and stop staring. I did not stay to watch the wreckage of their social climbing aspirations. I turned on my heel and walked out the side exit, navigating the plush carpeted hallways of the Oakhead Country Club until I reached the women's restroom. I pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped into the sanctuary of white marble, gold fixtures, and mirrored walls. The quiet hum of the ventilation system was a stark contrast to the shouting I had just left behind. I walked over to the vanity, gripping the cool edge of the marble sink, and took a slow, deep breath to steady my racing heart. For a fleeting second, the silence felt peaceful. Before I could even reach for the faucet, the restroom door violently slammed open, hitting the tiled wall with a sharp crack that echoed through the empty space. Chloe stormed inside, her face flushed a blotchy, uneven red that ruined her flawless bridal makeup. She was not alone. Julian shoved his way in right behind her, reaching back to twist the deadbolt lock with a heavy metallic thud. He turned to face me, and the charming, affable billionaire heir was completely gone. In his place stood a cornered, aggressive man who was entirely used to buying his way out of consequences. His jaw was clenched so tight, the muscles twitched, and his eyes were dark with unmasked fury. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" Julian demanded, stepping dangerously close to me. He pointed a rigid finger inches from my face, using his height to loom over me. "You walk in here dressed like a peasant and try to blow up my wedding with some fabricated architectural trivia. Do you have any idea how much money and how much public relations planning is riding on this marriage? You are not going to ruin my family's immaculate image just because you are jealous of your successful sister." I did not step back. I looked at the finger hovering near my face, then looked Julian dead in the eye. "It is not fabricated trivia, Julian. I built that support rig. Chloe stole the blueprints from my apartment 10 years ago. She committed academic and financial fraud, and your father just figured it out." "Shut up!" Chloe screamed, her voice shrill and bouncing off the marble walls. She shoved past Julian, her hands shaking so badly that her massive diamond engagement ring rattled against her designer clutch. She unclasped the bag and frantically dug inside, ripping out a slim leather checkbook and a silver pen. "You always ruin everything, Zora." Chloe spat furiously, scribbling on the paper, the pen tearing through the fine grain. "You could not just let me have this one night. You could not just stay in your lane and clean your stupid floors. You have always been bitter that Mom and Dad chose to invest in my potential instead of your ridiculous fantasies." She ripped the check from the pad and slammed it onto the marble counter right next to my purse. I glanced down at the cursive handwriting. It was a check made out to me for $5,000. "Take it!" Chloe ordered, her chest heaving as she tried to compose her ragged breathing. "Take the money. I know your little floor-cleaning hustle is practically bankrupt anyway. $5,000 is probably more than you make in 3 entire months of scrubbing toilets. Take the check, walk out the back door of this club, and get out of Atlanta by tomorrow morning. My lawyer will email you a strict non-disclosure agreement. You sign it. You keep your mouth shut about the Auburn Avenue project, and you never speak to the Sterlings or our parents again." I stared at the check, then up at my sister. $5,000 to erase my entire legacy. $5,000 to protect a lie that bought her a $250,000 medical career. It was a pathetic, insulting bribe that perfectly encapsulated how little they thought of me. "And if I do not?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of emotion. Julian stepped forward again, crowding my personal space, his physical intimidation tactics on full display. He crossed his arms over his tailored suit jacket and glared down at me with absolute contempt. "If you do not take the money and run," Julian sneered, his voice dropping into a menacing threat, "I will personally make sure you never find work in this state again. You do not seem to understand who you are dealing with. I am a Sterling. I have an army of elite corporate lawyers on retainer who specialize in burying pests exactly like you. If you breathe a single word of this to anyone, if you talk to the press, or if you ever approach my father again, I will tie you up in so much litigation you will be drowning in legal debt for the rest of your pathetic life. I will crush your little cleaning company into the dirt. I will take your cheap apartment and I will make sure you are sleeping on the street. Do you understand me?" They stood side by side, the golden child and the billionaire heir, completely convinced that their combined money and status gave them absolute power over my existence. They fully expected me to cower. They expected me to snatch the $5,000 check with trembling fingers, terrified of their corporate threats and desperate for their financial crumbs. They thought I was a vulnerable, uneducated laborer who could be easily crushed by the weight of their generational wealth. I did not touch the check. I did not blink. I slowly turned away from them and reached for the gold faucet. I turned the handle, letting the warm water run over the pristine marble basin. I placed my hands under the steady stream. I washed them methodically, feeling the slick soap glide over the thick, raised tissue of the scar on my left palm. The hot water rushed over the exact injury that had saved a historic monument, the injury that had just unraveled their entire fraudulent empire. Julian and Chloe watched me in stunned silence, clearly unnerved by my complete lack of panic. I turned off the water and reached for a plush cotton hand towel. I dried my hands with slow, deliberate precision. I intentionally flexed my left hand, making sure the scarred tissue stretched and caught the bright vanity lights. I dropped the towel into the brass hamper, then I turned to face them. I dropped the damp hand towel into the brass hamper, then I turned to face them. I let my eyes drift from the pathetic $5,000 check resting on the marble counter up to Chloe's frantic, blotchy face. I did not say a single word. I simply reached past her and picked up my battered leather work tote. Chloe scoffed, a harsh sound of triumph echoing off the restroom tiles. She assumed I was giving up. Julian let out a low, breathy chuckle, his aggressive posture relaxing as he believed his corporate intimidation had worked perfectly. He had completely dropped his charming nice guy facade, revealing the ruthless and entitled bully that lurked beneath his designer suit. He watched me with predatory satisfaction, fully expecting me to snatch the bribe off the counter and run out the back door. Instead, I opened my bag. I bypassed my car keys. I reached into the zippered pocket and pulled out a heavy, solid titanium corporate card. The matte black metal was completely unbendable, edged in brushed silver that caught the harsh glare of the overhead vanity lights. I lifted the card, angled the highly polished reflective surface toward my face, and calmly used it as a makeshift mirror to fix a slight smudge in my lip gloss. Julian let out a harsh barking laugh, though it sounded slightly forced. "What is that supposed to be a prop?" he mocked, stepping closer to me. "Do you really think flashing a fake black card is going to intimidate me? My family issues those cards to our junior executives to pay for business lunches. You are a janitor playing dress-up. Take the check before I lose my patience and call security to have you thrown off the property for trespassing." I lowered the card, tapping the heavy metal edge against the marble vanity. The sharp clink rang out loudly in the quiet restroom. I looked at Julian, letting a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. "It is truly fascinating how little you actually know about your own family's financial portfolio, Julian," I said, my voice completely relaxed. "You rely so heavily on your father's money to threaten people, but you clearly do not even bother to read the contracts your own trust fund signs." Julian frowned. His aggressive stance faltered for a fraction of a second. "What are you talking about?" Chloe slammed her hand flat against the marble counter, clearly desperate to regain control of the situation. "Stop trying to sound smart, Zora. Just take the money and leave. Nobody cares about your stupid floor cleaning hustle. You are embarrassing yourself. I am not a floor cleaner, Chloe. I corrected my tone, turning dangerously quiet. I am a master historical preservationist. I specialize in catastrophic structural stabilization for late 19th century commercial properties. And I do not have a hustle. I have a corporation. I flipped the titanium card over and slid it across the smooth marble counter. It came to a stop directly over Chloe's $5,000 check, completely covering her messy handwriting. The engraved silver letters gleamed perfectly under the lights. "Read it," I commanded. Chloe glared at me, her chest heaving with indignation, but her eyes involuntarily dropped to the heavy metal card. She read the name out loud, her voice dripping with absolute confusion. Heritage Restoration Group. So what? You registered an LLC for your mop buckets. Who cares? But Julian cared. The exact moment the words Heritage Restoration Group left Chloe's mouth, the arrogant, entitled smirk completely vanished from Julian's face. The color drained from his cheeks so fast he looked physically ill. He stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the tile until his shoulders hit the heavy oak door behind him. His eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated terror as he stared at the small metal card resting on the counter. "You," Julian choked out, his voice suddenly breathless and incredibly small. "You are the CEO of Heritage." My smile widened. "Yes, I am." Chloe looked back and forth between us, entirely lost. "Julian, what is going on? What does that mean?" Julian did not look at her. He could not take his eyes off me. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the internal mechanism click. He knew exactly what that corporate name meant. I stepped away from the sink, closing the distance between Julian and myself, until he was forced to press his back flat against the wood of the door. I looked up at him, letting the full weight of my authority replace my casual demeanor. "Let me explain it to your brilliant bride-to-be, Julian," I said, keeping my gaze locked on his terrified face. "The Sterling Family Trust recently acquired the dilapidated downtown Armory complex. It is a massive, highly publicized acquisition. Your father intends to turn it into a flagship commercial district. But the city council refused to grant your family the crucial commercial zoning permits unless you agreed to preserve the original brick archways and the collapsing iron roof structure." Julian swallowed hard. A bead of sweat broke out on his forehead, rolling down his temple to stain his crisp white collar. "To get those vital permits," I continued, my voice smooth and relentless, "the Sterling Trust had to hire the absolute best historical preservation firm in the Southeast. You needed a firm with an immaculate safety record, a firm that specialized in extreme structural stabilization. Your father's legal team spent 3 months vetting contractors before they blindly signed a $10 million non-negotiable exclusive retention contract with the premier agency in Atlanta." I reached back, picked up my titanium card from the counter, and held it up so the engraved letters were right in front of his eyes. "Heritage Restoration Group," I whispered. "You just threatened to use your corporate lawyers to bury the CEO of the exact elite firm that is holding your family's biggest real estate investment hostage." Julian opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He was suffocating on his own arrogance. Chloe finally caught up to the conversation. Her mouth fell open in absolute horror. $10 million, she gasped, staring at me as if I had suddenly transformed into an alien. "You have a $10 million contract with his father." "Oh, it gets infinitely better, Chloe," I said, turning my attention to my sister. "That commercial contract was specifically structured by my legal team. It has a strict non-cancellation clause. If the Sterling Trust fires me or attempts to breach the contract, they owe Heritage Restoration Group the full $10 million payout immediately. But more importantly, if I decide to walk away from the project, the city council will instantly revoke your father's commercial zoning permits. The entire Armory project will collapse, taking tens of millions of your family's investment capital straight down the drain with it." I took a step back, letting the sheer crushing magnitude of my leverage fully settle over them both. I own that project, Julian, which means I own your father's construction timeline, I own your trust fund's profit margins, and right now, I own you. I slid the titanium card smoothly back into my tote bag. So tell me again how you are going to use your lawyers to crush my little cleaning company into the dirt. Tell me again how you are going to force me to sleep on the street. I did not wait for Julian to formulate a response. His mouth was hanging open, his face pale, entirely stripped of the arrogant sneer he had worn just minutes ago. Chloe was visibly shaking, staring at the titanium card as if it were a venomous snake. I picked up my bag, turned my back on them, and walked out of the restroom. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, sealing them in their own manufactured nightmare. The main dining hall had transformed into a theater of hushed whispers. Guests leaned across their tables, their eyes darting toward the terrace, where Richard Sterling was currently obliterating my mother's social standing. The clinking of glasses had stopped. The jazz band was playing a painfully upbeat tune that entirely failed to mask the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. I navigated the perimeter of the room, intending to find my coat and leave this toxic charade behind forever. Before I could reach the cloakroom, a heavy hand clamped down on my bicep. The grip was punishing, meant to control and intimidate. I turned to see my father, Carlton. His face was a mask of tightly controlled rage, the veins in his neck bulging against his starched white collar. He did not say a word. He simply yanked me backward, pulling me away from the crowd and forcing me down a dimly lit, narrow corridor reserved for the country club staff. He shoved me into a private cigar lounge, a room filled with the scent of aged leather and stale tobacco smoke, and slammed the door shut. He turned the brass lock, securing us inside. "What is wrong with you?" Carlton hissed, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Have you completely lost your mind? You walk into the most important night of your sister's life and deliberately try to sabotage her future. Do you have any idea what is at stake here?" I yanked my arm out of his grasp, rubbing the skin where his fingers had dug in. I did not sabotage anything I said, keeping my posture rigid. Richard Sterling asked a technical question. I answered it. It is not my fault that Chloe spent the last decade building a medical career on a foundation of stolen architectural blueprints. My father stepped forward, using his physical size to tower over me, a tactic he had utilized since I was a child. He always believed that volume and proximity equaled authority. "This is not about some stupid restoration project," he snapped, waving his hand dismissively, as if my life's blood was a trivial inconvenience. "This is about family legacy, Zora. The Sterling family is corporate royalty in this city. Chloe marrying Julian elevates all of us. It opens doors that have been closed to this family for generations. We are talking about board seats, country club equity, and generational wealth. You are supposed to be supporting your sister, not throwing a selfish tantrum because you are jealous of her success." "Jealous," I repeated, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "You let her steal my architectural blueprints so you could finance her medical degree. You let Richard Sterling believe she was the prodigy who saved the Auburn Avenue estate. You stole my physical labor, and now you want me to fall in line to protect your social climbing." Carlton's expression turned to ice. He dropped the angry lecturing father routine entirely. The mask slipped, revealing the ruthless, calculating opportunist who had always viewed his children as assets on a balance sheet. "You have always been difficult, Zora," he said coldly. "You always wanted to do things the hard way, digging in the dirt instead of making the right connections. Chloe plays the game. She understands what it takes to survive in this echelon. And right now, she needs our help. The Sterlings are demanding a strict prenuptial agreement. Richard requires Chloe to bring a significant liquid asset baseline into the marriage to prove she is not just a gold digger after Julian's trust fund." I stared at him, a creeping sense of dread pooling in my stomach. "And what does Chloe's prenuptial agreement have to do with me?" "Your grandfather's estate," Carlton said smoothly, stepping toward a small mahogany card table in the center of the room. My heart stopped. Grandpa Henry had been the only person in this family who ever saw my true value. He was the one who bought me my first drafting table. He was the one who encouraged me to study structural engineering while my parents were busy parading Chloe around beauty pageants and elite prep schools. When he passed away 6 months ago, his will had placed his historic properties and a significant cash trust entirely in my name. "You are not touching his estate," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "He left that to me." My father picked up a thick manila folder from the card table and casually tossed it down in front of me. "He left it to you when he was not thinking clearly." Carlton corrected, his tone dripping with patronizing arrogance. "Vivica and I have already spoken to the estate lawyers. We are the executors. We are legally restructuring the trust as of tomorrow morning to redirect those properties and assets to Chloe. She needs that portfolio to satisfy Richard Sterling's corporate lawyers. You, on the other hand, do not need millions of dollars to clean floors." I looked down at the folder, sickened by the absolute ease with which he justified robbing me. "You cannot legally restructure a finalized trust without my signature. I am the sole beneficiary." "Exactly," my father said, a cruel, triumphant smile stretching across his face. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out an expensive fountain pen, and set it carefully on top of the folder. "Which is why you are going to sign these documents right now." I let out a harsh breath, shaking my head. "You are delusional if you think I am signing away my inheritance to fund Chloe's fraudulent marriage." Carlton did not flinch. He simply reached out and flipped the folder open. Inside were not just trust transfer documents. Resting right on top was a meticulously itemized, legally drafted invoice. I stared at the bold print at the top of the page. It was a bill drafted by my parents' legal team, made out directly to me. I scanned the absurd fabricated charges. They had itemized my childhood. They had listed food, basic clothing, my brief community college tuition, and a massive penalty fee. "If you refuse to sign over the estate," Carlton said, his voice deadly quiet, "then Vivica and I are formally calling in your debts. We calculated every cent we spent raising you. The total comes to exactly $100,000 in back rent for living under our roof until you were 18. You sign away your grandfather's estate to Chloe tonight, or I will file this invoice in court tomorrow and bankrupt whatever miserable little life you have managed to scrape together." The heavy oak door of the cigar lounge seemed to absorb all the ambient noise from the country club, creating a vacuum of silence that amplified my father's ragged breathing. He stood absolutely frozen, his eyes locked on the embossed corporate seal. The expensive paper trembled slightly in his grasp. The aggressive, domineering patriarch who had shoved me into this room just minutes ago had completely vanished. "You are lying," Carlton rasped, though his voice lacked any real conviction. "You do not have the capital to buy out a commercial mortgage of that magnitude. You clean floors for a living. You are trying to run a bluff to get out of paying what you owe this family." I picked up my gold fountain pen, capping it with a sharp, definitive click. "I run a multi-million-dollar historical preservation firm," I corrected him, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "My holding company aggressively acquires distressed assets. Your estate was flagged in our system because you missed 2 consecutive payments while you were busy buying custom floral arrangements for Chloe's wedding. I bought your debt for pennies on the dollar. You handed me the perfect weapon to dismantle your life, and you did not even realize it." My father staggered back a half step, his calves hitting the edge of a leather armchair. He dropped the forged invoice and the trust transfer documents onto the mahogany table as if they had suddenly caught fire. The reality of his situation was finally penetrating his thick skull. "You cannot do this," he stammered, his confident posture collapsing inward. "You cannot evict your own parents. Where are we supposed to go? How are we supposed to explain this to the Sterlings? We are about to merge our families. This will cause a massive public scandal." I slung my leather tote bag over my shoulder. "That sounds like a public relations nightmare you should have anticipated before you tried to extort your own daughter. You wanted me to sign away my grandfather's estate to protect your social standing. You wanted to charge me $100,000 for the basic human right of existing in your house as a child. Well, I just paid my debt. And in return, I am taking your house." I walked toward the door, my heels sinking into the plush carpet. Before I reached the brass handle, Carlton lunged forward, desperation entirely overriding his pride. He grabbed my arm again, but this time there was no violent force behind his grip. His fingers were weak and shaking. "Zora, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "You cannot take the house. It is all we have left. The equity is completely drained. If you foreclose on us, Vivica and I will be utterly ruined. The country club will revoke our membership. Chloe's wedding will be canceled. We will have absolutely nothing. I looked down at the hand clutching my arm. It was the same hand that had waved away my academic awards. It was the same hand that had eagerly signed the checks for Chloe's stolen medical tuition. It was the hand that had just drafted a fake invoice to rob me of my beloved grandfather's final gift. I reached over and forcefully peeled his fingers off my sleeve, dropping his hand back to his side. "You already have nothing, Carlton," I said coldly. "You built your entire life on a foundation of lies and stolen blueprints. You chose to invest every ounce of your love and loyalty into a daughter who is currently watching her fraudulent career burn to ashes in the dining room next door. You made your choices. Now you get to live in the wreckage." I turned the brass deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open. The sound of the jazz band and the muted, panicked murmurs of the country club guests instantly flooded into the quiet lounge. I stepped out into the hallway, leaving my father standing alone in the dim light, staring at the embossed corporate seal that had just signed away his entire existence. I did not look back. I walked straight down the corridor past the restrooms where Julian and Chloe were likely still suffocating in their own manufactured panic, and headed directly for the main lobby. The valets were scrambling outside the glass entrance, rushing to bring expensive cars around for the guests, who were hurriedly fleeing the disastrous rehearsal dinner. Before I could reach the exit, my phone began to vibrate violently in my bag, the screen illuminated with a rapid succession of urgent text messages. I pulled it out and glanced at the notifications. They were all from a private group chat I had created with the senior executive team at Heritage Restoration Group. The first message was from my lead project manager. "Sterling Trust legal team just sent a frantic email. They are begging for an emergency meeting tomorrow morning regarding the armory contract. They sound completely panicked." The second message was from my chief financial officer. "Just received a wire transfer alert. Julian Sterling's private account just attempted to process a $500,000 deposit into our corporate escrow. Looks like an unauthorized bribe attempt to secure your silence." I stopped walking and stared at the screen. A cold, genuine smile spread across my face. Julian was terrified. He was throwing $500,000 of his personal trust fund at me in a desperate, pathetic attempt to stop me from pulling the plug on the armory project and destroying his family's commercial zoning permits. He thought he could buy his way out of the trap he had walked himself into. I typed a swift, concise reply to my executive team. "Reject the wire transfer immediately. Deny the emergency meeting request. Tell the Sterling legal team that the CEO of Heritage Restoration is currently unavailable, and any further communication must be submitted in writing. We hold the line." I locked my phone and slid it back into my bag. I pushed through the glass doors of the Oakhead Country Club and stepped out into the humid Atlanta night air. The oppressive tension of the evening instantly vanished, replaced by the exhilarating, undeniable thrill of absolute freedom. I took a deep breath, savoring the scent of jasmine and the sweet taste of complete victory. My car was waiting at the edge of the circular driveway. As I walked toward it, a sleek black town car suddenly pulled up to the curb tires, screeching as it came to an abrupt halt right in front of me. The tinted rear window rolled down smoothly, revealing the sharp, calculating face of Richard Sterling. "Get in, Zora," the billionaire commanded, his voice completely stripped of the pleasantries he had used earlier in the evening. "We have a $10 million contract to renegotiate, and I believe you and I have a great deal to discuss regarding the future of my son's wedding." I had spent the entire car ride from the country club with Richard Sterling restructuring the terms of our $10 million contract. By the time the sun rose over Atlanta, I had secured an ironclad agreement that effectively made me the principal director of the Auburn Avenue project. Richard, a pragmatist to his absolute core, cared only about his bottom line. He did not care about his son's bruised ego, and he certainly did not care about my parents' desperate social climbing ambitions. He recognized a shark when he saw one, and he simply told me to attend the morning brunch to keep the peace, while his legal team drafted our new binding paperwork. At 11 o'clock, my parents hosted a lavish post-rehearsal gathering at their sprawling suburban McMansion. It was a transparent, frantic attempt to smooth over the palpable tension that had nearly destroyed the previous night. I walked through the heavy double doors wearing a tailored linen suit, entirely immune to the hostile, panicked glares my parents shot in my direction. I grabbed a cup of black coffee and leaned against the far wall of the dining room, quietly watching the spectacular charade unfold. Vivica was in full performance mode. She wore a floral silk dress, fluttering nervously between tables of catered crab cakes and imported caviar. She poured mimosas for Julian's extended family with a bright plastic smile that did not quite reach her eyes. The Sterling relatives sat stiffly on my parents' velvet sofas, quietly judging the faux marble columns, the ostentatious gold chandeliers, and the overwhelming desperation of the entire event. Chloe looked like she had not slept a single minute. She gripped her crystal champagne flute so tightly her knuckles were stark white, her eyes darting nervously toward me every time I shifted my weight. Carlton tapped a silver spoon against his glass to command the room. He forced a jovial, booming laugh, though the muscles in his jaw were ticking erratically. "Family and distinguished guests," Carlton announced, raising his glass toward Julian and Chloe. "Despite a few minor misunderstandings yesterday, today is about celebrating the bright future ahead. It is about two great families coming together to build a legacy of prosperity and unity that will last for generations." To Julian and Chloe. He was just about to drink when the heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed sharply through the foyer. Vivica frowned, her perfect host routine faltering. She signaled a caterer to fetch it, but the loud, persistent, heavy knocking continued. Excusing herself with a tight, apologetic smile to the Sterling matriarchs, Vivica marched into the entryway. The entire living room fell silent. We could all hear the brief, sharp exchange. A uniformed courier was standing on the front steps. He handed Vivica a thick, legal-sized manila envelope, demanded her signature on his digital pad, and promptly turned on his heel. Vivica walked back into the dining room, her brow furrowed in deep annoyance as she tore the perforated edge of the envelope. She pulled out a thick stack of heavy watermarked documents. She scanned the first page. Then a sound completely devoid of her usual refined elegance ripped from her throat. It was a raw, piercing scream of pure, unadulterated panic. The champagne glass slipped from her hand, shattering against the hardwood floor and sending a spray of orange liquid across her designer shoes. Vivica Carlton demanded, rushing to her side in a panic. He snatched the papers from her trembling hands. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and gray. It was the formal eviction notice. The final, non-negotiable declaration that their property was being seized by the end of the month, terminating their residence due to gross financial delinquency. Vivica's head snapped up, her eyes locked onto me, wild, erratic, and filled with venom. She raised a violently shaking finger, pointing it directly at my face in front of the entire assembly of Sterling elites. "You did this!" Vivica shrieked, her voice breaking and echoing off the high ceilings. "You miserable, ungrateful wretch! You could not stand seeing your sister happy. You called the bank, did not you? You called in some fake anonymous tip about our credit to ruin us." The Sterling relatives gasped, setting their porcelain plates down as the high society brunch devolved into absolute chaos. Carlton tried to grab Vivica's arm to silence her, completely terrified of the wealthy spectators witnessing their financial ruin, but she shoved him away with surprising force. "She is unstable," Vivica cried out to the horrified Sterling family, desperately trying to control the narrative by weaponizing my past. "She is a pathetic college dropout who cleans floors for a living. She has been insanely jealous of Chloe since the day she was born. She fabricated this entire fake eviction notice to sabotage this wedding and humiliate our family." Chloe buried her face in her hands, letting out a loud sob as her perfect day disintegrated into a public spectacle. Julian, however, saw an opportunity to play the hero. He wanted to regain the dominant, untouchable billionaire persona he had lost in the country club restroom the night before. He wanted to prove to his judging relatives that he could handle a minor disturbance. He set his drink down with a loud thud and marched aggressively across the room. He puffed out his chest, stepping directly into my personal space, using his height to physically intimidate me, just as my father always did. He looked down his nose at me, his face set in a mask of absolute arrogant contempt. I think you have done enough damage for one weekend. Zora, Julian sneered, his voice booming loud enough for his entire family to hear. It is time you know your place and get out of the wealthy folks' business. Julian's words hung in the stale air of the dining room. He stood with his shoulders squared, completely satisfied with his performance, waiting for the Sterling relatives to murmur their approval. He expected me to shrink back, humiliated by my mother's shrieking accusations and his aggressive posturing. Before I could even open my mouth, a loud, deliberate throat clearing shattered the heavy silence. Everyone turned toward the foyer. The uniformed courier was still standing on the marble entryway, his digital pad resting against his hip. He looked entirely unimpressed by the display of extreme wealth and the hysterical crying happening in front of him. "Excuse me," the courier said, his voice projecting effortlessly over the quiet jazz music still playing from the hidden speakers. "I am just here to deliver the legal notices, but I think there is a significant misunderstanding regarding the nature of this document." Vivica whipped her head around, her face blotchy and mascara running down her cheeks. She pointed a trembling finger at the door. "We do not care what you have to say. Get out of my house before I call the police." The courier did not flinch. He simply looked down at his digital manifest and tapped the screen. "It is not a standard bank foreclosure, ma'am," he announced, his voice carrying perfectly across the silent, captivated audience. "The mortgage was not seized by a lending institution due to delinquent payments. It was acquired in a direct, expedited cash buyout." Carlton pushed past Vivica, snatching the envelope from her hands and staring wildly at the courier. "What are you talking about? Who bought it? What bank approved a cash buyout without notifying me?" The courier looked up, meeting my father's panicked gaze with absolute professional detachment. "No bank was involved, sir. The deed was officially transferred at 8 o'clock this morning to a private corporate entity. The new sole proprietor of this estate is Heritage Holdings, LLC. The name dropped like a physical weight into the middle of the room. Julian physically recoiled. The arrogant, puffed-out chest instantly deflated. His jaw went slack, and the color drained from his face so rapidly he looked like he might pass out right there on the Persian rug. He recognized the name instantly from our encounter in the country club restroom the night before. He knew exactly who owned Heritage Holdings. Vivica and Carlton, however, were still desperately trying to connect the dots. Heritage Holdings. Carlton muttered, his eyes darting frantically over the legal paperwork in his hands. "Who is that? What is Heritage Holdings?" I did not let the courier answer him. I stepped away from the wall, the soft click of my heels cutting through the dead silence of the dining room. I walked directly past Julian, completely ignoring his frozen, terrified form, and moved into the center of the foyer. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a thick, crisp document bearing the official county seal. I unfolded it with a sharp, definitive snap that echoed in the high-ceilinged room. "A jealous, unstable dropout," I said, looking directly at my mother. My voice was perfectly calm, completely devoid of the hysterical emotion she was currently displaying. "That is a fascinating narrative, Vivica. It is a compelling story to tell your wealthy new friends, especially since that dropout just paid off the massive crippling debt you accumulated while buying imported caviar to impress them." Vivica stared at me, her breath hitching in her throat. Her eyes dropped to the paper in my hand, then back up to my face. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling with sudden, horrifying realization. Carlton stepped forward, his face flushed with a desperate, furious panic. "Zora, what have you done? We can fix this privately. This is a family matter. Do not do this right now." "Privately," I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Like the private conversation we had last night in the cigar lounge, Carlton, where you locked me in a room, handed me a fabricated invoice for $100,000, and demanded back rent for raising me. You threatened to ruin my life and bankrupt my company if I did not sign away my grandfather's entire estate to Chloe to satisfy her prenuptial agreement." A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the Sterling relatives. I saw Richard Sterling standing near the back of the room, swirling his drink. He did not look shocked. He looked calculating, watching the destruction of my parents' social standing with cold, pragmatic interest. Chloe let out a loud, wretched sob, burying her face against the velvet sofa. Julian did not move to comfort her. He remained rooted to the spot, entirely neutralized. I turned my attention to Julian, letting my gaze sweep over his expensive suit and terrified posture. "You told me to get out of the wealthy folks' business, Julian. You told me to know my place. The problem is you do not actually own anything. You just spend your father's money and hide behind his lawyers. I built an empire from the ground up with the very hands your bride mocked. I do not play in your business. I buy it." I turned back to my parents. They stood side by side, completely stripped of their arrogance, their social climbing ambitions reduced to ash in front of the very people they had desperately tried to impress. They had weaponized my childhood, dismissed my intelligence, and tried to steal my grandfather's legacy to fund their delusions of grandeur. I held up the property deed, ensuring the embossed corporate seal of Heritage Holdings caught the light from the crystal chandelier above us. I looked my father dead in the eye, delivering the final, absolute truth of their new reality. "You have exactly 30 minutes to clear your guests off my property," I said, my voice ringing out with absolute, undeniable authority. "My house, my rules, get out." The absolute silence that followed my command was deafening. The only sound left in the dining room was the soft, upbeat tempo of the jazz band still playing through the hidden ceiling speakers, creating a surreal soundtrack to my parents' complete financial ruin. A catered tray of mimosas clattered against a marble countertop as a waiter hurriedly backed out of the room, sensing the volatile shift in the atmosphere. Richard Sterling remained completely impassive, his sharp eyes darting from the eviction notice in Carlton's hand to my face, silently calculating the shifting power dynamics. The rest of the Sterling family, however, began to shift uncomfortably. A few of the older aunts whispered behind manicured hands, subtly gathering their designer clutches and inching toward the foyer. They were old money, and nothing terrified old money more than the stench of sudden, unmitigated poverty. Carlton saw them moving. He saw the generational wealth and social status he had spent his entire life groveling for slipping through his fingers in real time. The sheer desperation in his eyes morphed into a frantic, manic energy. He straightened his tailored linen jacket, cleared his throat loudly, and forced a booming theatrical laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. "This is nothing but a clerical error," Carlton announced, throwing his arms open wide and projecting his voice toward the retreating Sterling relatives. "A minor administrative oversight by our accountants. We were already in the process of liquidating this property anyway." Vivica, entirely attuned to her husband's desperate pivot, immediately wiped the smeared mascara from her cheeks. She snatched a fresh flute of champagne from a passing tray and stepped forward, plastering on a bright, utterly unhinged smile. "Carlton is entirely correct," Vivica trilled, her voice pitching an octave higher than normal to mask her panic. "We were simply waiting for the right moment to announce our transition. This house, well, it was always just a suburban starter home. It is a bit gaudy, do not you think? A bit nouveau riche. We have been planning to return to our true roots for months." Chloe lowered her hands from her face, looking at our mother with absolute bewilderment, but Vivica ignored her. She walked directly toward Julian, who was still standing rigidly in the center of the room, completely emasculated by his earlier attempt to intimidate me. Vivica placed a comforting maternal hand on his arm. "We are moving our primary assets back into the city," Vivica declared proudly, making sure Richard Sterling was well within earshot. "We are returning to Big Mama's historic brownstone in the Sweet Auburn district. That is where our true generational wealth lies. It is a cornerstone of this city's history, completely paid off and worth an absolute fortune in today's real estate market." Carlton stepped up beside her, mirroring her manufactured confidence. He clapped Julian on the shoulder, giving him a firm, masculine shake. "Exactly," Carlton boomed. "Real wealth is not tied up in suburban mortgages. It is anchored in legacy." In fact, Julian, we were saving this surprise for the wedding reception, but given the circumstances, we might as well share the good news now. Vivica and I have officially put Big Mama's brownstone entirely in Chloe's name. Julian blinked, his greedy instincts temporarily overriding his terror. He stood a little taller, his eyes darting toward his father. "That property is a multi-million-dollar historical asset," Carlton continued lowering his voice into a conspiratorial businessman-to-businessman tone, though he was projecting loudly enough for everyone to hear. We know your father has been hesitant to fund your new tech startup. We know you need significant liquid collateral to secure the venture capital loans. Chloe's new portfolio provides exactly the leverage you need to get your software company off the ground. We are investing in your future son. Julian's chest puffed out again. The prospect of millions of dollars in free collateral was enough to immediately wipe away the memory of his public humiliation. He smiled down at Chloe, who was quickly dabbing her eyes with a silk napkin, realizing that her parents were currently saving her golden ticket into the Sterling Empire. Vivica turned her back on Julian and faced me. The maternal accommodating mask instantly dissolved, replaced by a sneer of absolute unvarnished hatred. She pointed her champagne flute directly at my chest, the liquid sloshing over the crystal rim. You thought you could destroy us, Zora. Vivica spat, her voice dropping into a venomous hiss. You thought you could waltz in here with your little corporate buyout and leave us on the street. You are nothing but a jealous, unstable dropout who could never handle the fact that your sister is brilliant. I stood my ground, my posture perfectly relaxed, watching her dig her own grave. You sold your soul? Vivica continued, her volume rising as she played to the gallery of wealthy onlookers. You run around claiming to be a preservationist, but you are just a corporate puppet. You are trying to steal Black history. You are trying to steal our legacy and hand it over to your white corporate bosses at Heritage Holdings just to settle a petty childhood grudge. Carlton nodded in agreement, crossing his arms over his chest. She is a traitor to her own blood, he declared loudly. She would rather see her own sister fail than build something meaningful herself. You can keep this gaudy piece of sheetrock, Zora. We have real heritage. They stood shoulder to shoulder, incredibly proud of their rapid spin control. They had successfully deflected the shame of the eviction, secured Julian's fragile ego with the promise of a massive financial asset, and painted me as a bitter, unstable sellout who was simply acting as an attack dog for a faceless corporate entity. They fully believed they had outsmarted me. They fully believed they had won. I looked at my mother's triumphant, vicious smile. I looked at Carlton's smug, arrogant posture. Then I looked at Julian, who was currently whispering excitedly to Chloe about the venture capital he was going to secure using my grandfather's house. The sheer, unadulterated delusion radiating from my family was too much to process in silence. I threw my head back and laughed. It was not a polite chuckle or a nervous reaction. It was a cold, hard, echoing sound that sliced right through the lingering jazz music and the muted, anxious murmurs of the Sterling family. The sound was so completely devoid of warmth that it made Vivica physically flinch. The triumphant sneer melted off her face, instantly replaced by a flicker of genuine, unmasked uncertainty. Julian abruptly stopped whispering to Chloe. The entire room went dead silent, every single eye locked on me as my laughter faded into a sharp, terrifying smile. You put the house in Chloe's name. I repeated, testing the words on my tongue as if they were made of ash. You marched down to the county clerk, signed a quitclaim deed, and handed a multi-million-dollar piece of historic Auburn Avenue real estate over to a 24-year-old with a fraudulent medical degree. That is a brilliant financial strategy, Carlton. It really is. There is just one massive, insurmountable problem with your little real estate pivot. I stepped away from the wall and walked slowly toward the center of the room. The Sterling relatives parted like the Red Sea, pulling their designer skirts and tailored suits out of my path. I stopped at the edge of the dining table, resting my hands on the polished mahogany surface. You cannot transfer a deed you do not own, I stated clearly. Carlton bristled, his face turning an ugly mottled shade of plum. The veins in his neck strained against his silk collar. What are you talking about? He barked, attempting to summon his usual patriarchal thunder. Big Mama left that house to me. I am her only son. I am the head of this family. I have the original paperwork sitting in my fireproof safe upstairs right now. You are making a fool of yourself in front of our guests. I shook my head, maintaining complete icy composure while his blood pressure skyrocketed. You have a piece of paper, Carlton. You do not have the deed. Big Mama loved you. But she was a fiercely intelligent woman, and she was not blind. She saw exactly what you were becoming the moment you married Vivica. Vivica gasped loudly, clutching her pearls in a dramatic display of manufactured outrage. "How dare you speak about the dead that way? She worshipped your father. She loved us." "She loved her history," I corrected sharply, my voice cutting through Vivica's fake theatrics like a blade. "She loved the community she built. And she knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that you would pave over her entire legacy the second you needed liquid cash. She watched you drain your savings to buy into the Oakhead Country Club. She watched you lease luxury cars you could not afford and buy custom jewelry on credit just to pretend you belonged in a tax bracket that was always miles out of your reach. She knew that the second she took her last breath, you would mortgage her historic home to the hilt just to maintain your fragile fake high society image. Carlton took a step back, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The Sterling patriarchs were watching him with open disgust, recognizing the exact type of desperate social climber they despised. "That is why she never left the brownstone to you." I continued pacing slowly around the edge of the table. 3 months before she passed away, Big Mama hired an independent estate lawyer. She transferred the entire Auburn Avenue property into an irrevocable blind trust. She legally severed your access to the estate before you even knew she was sick. You have been living a lie for 10 years, Carlton. You never owned Big Mama's house. You were essentially a glorified squatter playing dress-up with an asset you never possessed. Julian lunged forward, his eyes darting wildly between Carlton's panicked face and my calm one. His venture capital dreams, his entire reason for marrying into this bankrupt family, were evaporating in front of his eyes. "This is a bluff," Julian declared, his voice cracking slightly, lacking its usual booming authority. "You are making this up to ruin the wedding." Richard Sterling stood utterly still in the background, holding his cocktail, watching me dismantle his son's future with a predator's appreciation. I reached into my leather tote bag for the second time that morning. I bypassed my gold fountain pen. I bypassed the Heritage Holdings corporate seal that had just evicted my parents. Instead, I pulled out a thick, heavy leather-bound ledger. It was worn at the edges, packed tight with a decade of meticulous financial records, tax receipts, and preservation invoices. I raised the ledger high in the air and slammed it down onto the center of the dining table. The heavy thud made the crystal champagne flutes rattle violently against the serving trays. "Read it," I commanded, staring directly into Julian's wide, terrified eyes. "I am not a corporate puppet stealing Black history. I am the sole trustee of the Auburn Heritage Trust. For the past 10 years, I have been using my own millions from my restoration firm to pay the skyrocketing property taxes your prospective father-in-law neglected. I funded the historic roof repairs. I updated the commercial plumbing. I preserved my family's legacy while Vivica and Carlton were busy throwing away their money on country club dues and fake floral arrangements." I leaned across the table, my voice dropping to a deadly absolute whisper that carried to every corner of the silent room. "You cannot use Big Mama's house as collateral, Julian, because your future in-laws do not own a single brick of it. They own absolutely nothing." The backlash began exactly 24 hours after I walked out of my parents' dining room. I was sitting at the head of the conference table in the downtown headquarters of Heritage Restoration Group, reviewing the final blueprints for the Auburn Avenue Armory renovation, when my phone vibrated so violently it nearly rattled off the mahogany surface. It was not a single notification. It was a torrential, ceaseless flood of alerts. "Marcus." My director of public relations burst through the heavy glass doors of the conference room without knocking. His face was flushed, and he was clutching his tablet like a shield. Behind him, my chief financial officer looked equally pale. "You need to see this immediately," Marcus said, his voice stripped of its usual polished calm. He slid the tablet across the table. The screen displayed a social media live stream that had already amassed hundreds of thousands of views. There was Chloe sitting on the edge of an impeccably staged, neutral-colored sofa. She wore no makeup, her hair pulled back into a messy bun to emphasize her manufactured vulnerability. She was crying real heavy tears. Julian sat beside her, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders, staring into the camera with a look of manufactured righteous indignation. "My sister is trying to destroy us," Chloe choked out in the video, wiping her eyes with a tissue. She used her corporate connections to manipulate my grandmother in her final days. She tricked a dying woman into signing over the family estate into a blind trust. Now she is using that stolen wealth to evict our parents and ruin my wedding. She is a fraud, and she is committing elder abuse to steal from her own blood. Julian leaned into the frame, his jaw set. "We will not be intimidated by corporate bullying," he declared to their massive online audience. "Heritage Holdings is a corrupt entity. We are asking everyone to stand with us. Demand justice for the real victims of corporate gentrification and elder financial abuse." I locked the tablet screen and pushed it back toward Marcus. My pulse did not rise. My hands remained perfectly steady. They had lost their house, their assets, and their leverage, so they had retreated to the only arena where they still possessed any currency: the internet. "It is trending everywhere," Marcus said, swiping his hand over his face. "They are weaponizing their influencer network. Julian's fraternity brothers and country club associates are sharing it across every major platform. The narrative is spinning completely out of our control. They are painting you as a ruthless, gentrifying corporate monster who abuses the elderly." My CFO stepped forward, placing a thick stack of printed emails on the table. "It is not just internet noise, Zora. It is bleeding into our bottom line. Our phones have not stopped ringing all morning." I picked up the first email. It was from the Historic Preservation Board. They were demanding an emergency review of our ethical guidelines. The second email was from our lead architectural firm, pausing their contract negotiations pending a public explanation of the elder abuse allegations. The third was a direct threat from a major venture capital group that co-funded our downtown restorations. They were giving me 48 hours to clear my name, or they were pulling their $8 million investment, citing a breach of the morality clause. Chloe and Julian were cornered animals, and they were thrashing wildly. By dragging Heritage Holdings into a fabricated public scandal, they were hoping to trigger a boardroom panic. They assumed I would cave under the pressure of losing my elite investors. They wanted to force me to the negotiating table, where I would quietly hand over the deeds to the brownstone and the McMansion, just to make the viral nightmare go away. "We need a press release immediately," Marcus urged, pacing the length of the conference room. "I have already drafted a statement completely denying the allegations. We need to release the legal documentation proving the blind trust was established legally and independently. We need our legal team to hit them with a massive cease and desist order for defamation and slander. If we do not kill this story by noon, the board of directors might force a vote of no confidence." I picked up my coffee cup, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set it down. "We are not releasing a statement," I said. Marcus stopped pacing, staring at me as if I had just lost my mind. "Zora, our biggest investors are threatening to walk. This is a targeted, synchronized smear campaign. It is character assassination. You cannot just ignore this." I stood up, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the bustling Atlanta skyline. I looked down at the streets where my grandfather had once laid brick and mortar. He had taught me that the loudest person in the room was always the weakest. He taught me that when a liar is performing for a crowd, you never interrupt them. You let them talk until they contradict themselves. "A press release is defensive," I explained, keeping my tone completely even. "A cease and desist letter tells them they have struck a nerve. If we fight them in the court of public opinion, we validate their lies. We turn a fabricated family tantrum into a legitimate corporate debate. I will not engage in a digital mudslinging contest with a spoiled socialite and a desperate trust fund baby." "But the contracts," my CFO protested. "The investors are demanding answers." "Let them demand," I replied sharply. "Tell the investors that Heritage Holdings does not respond to internet gossip. If they want to pull their capital based on a crying influencer's video, let them walk. I only do business with people who value hard evidence over digital theatrics. We hold the line." Marcus dragged a hand through his hair, clearly struggling to comprehend my strategy. "Zora, they are destroying your reputation. If we do not fight back, what exactly are we waiting for?" I turned away from the window and faced my panicked executive team. I rested my hands on the back of my leather chair. "I am waiting for them to forget that the internet is not the real world. I said, a cold, predatory smile forming on my face. Right now, they feel untouchable because they are hiding behind screens and comment sections. They think they can win this war with hashtags and fake tears. But Julian and Chloe are deeply arrogant, and arrogance breeds impatience. When they realize I am completely ignoring their digital warfare, their egos will not be able to handle the silence. They will escalate. I tapped my fingers rhythmically against the leather chair. They are going to get angry. They are going to get sloppy. I am not fighting a war in the comment sections, Marcus. I am waiting for them to make a physical mistake. I am waiting for them to commit a felony in broad daylight. Do not issue a single word. Let them keep digging. The dust inside the Auburn Avenue Armory danced in the thick shafts of morning sunlight piercing through the newly installed industrial windows. The cavernous space echoed with the relentless noise of commercial drills, the shouts of my foremen, and the heavy thud of raw timber being stacked. I stood in the center of the main hall, wearing a tailored blazer and a hard hat, reviewing the structural blueprints for the multi-million-dollar restoration. I had been waiting for 48 hours since the internet erupted with Chloe's fake tears. I knew the silence from my end would drive them insane. I knew it was only a matter of time before they made a fatal physical mistake. The heavy steel double doors at the front of the armory slammed open. The sudden violent noise cut through the ambient sounds of construction, causing my lead contractor to lower his drill. Vivica marched into the active work zone like she was walking a red carpet. She wore a pristine white designer trench coat and oversized sunglasses, her heels clicking aggressively against the concrete floor. She looked entirely out of place in an active construction site, but it was the man walking nervously beside her that caught my full attention. It was my cousin Trayvon. Trevin had dropped out of community college 3 separate times and currently lived in his mother's basement. Today, however, he was wearing a neon yellow reflective vest, a brand new white hard hat, and clutching a metal clipboard. Clipped to his chest was a highly realistic but entirely counterfeit City of Atlanta building inspector badge. "Shut it down!" Trevon yelled, his voice cracking slightly before he cleared his throat and tried to project deeper. "Stop all work immediately. I am shutting this site down." My crew went entirely still. The foreman looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. I raised a single hand, signaling everyone to power down their tools. The sudden quiet in the massive hall was absolute, heavy with suspended dust and mounting tension. I turned slowly to face my mother and her newly deputized accomplice. Vivica smiled, a razor-sharp predatory grin that stretched across her face. She stepped over a pile of reclaimed brick and stopped a few feet away from me, crossing her arms. "It is such a tragedy," Zora Vivica cooed, her voice dripping with manufactured sympathy. A multi-million-dollar historic restoration project completely derailed by severe structural negligence. The fines alone will bankrupt Heritage Holdings. Your investors are already panicking about the elder abuse allegations online. When they see a total city shutdown, they will liquidate your firm by Friday. Trayvon was already moving around the perimeter of the room, clicking his pen frantically. He walked up to a primary load-bearing timber column that held up the entire eastern wing of the roof. "Improper load distribution," Trayvon announced, loudly slapping a bright red demolition sticker directly onto the historic wood. "Unsafe electrical wiring. Foundation instability. I am tagging these load-bearing walls for immediate demolition and condemning this property." He pulled a can of red spray paint from his tool belt and drew a massive jagged X across the pristine brick wall we had just spent 2 weeks power washing. Vivica stepped closer, dropping the theatrical voice and lowering her tone into a venomous hiss. "The internet is destroying your reputation, Zora, but this will destroy your bank account. You are going to hand over the trust ledger today. You are going to sign the brownstone over to Carlton, and you are going to issue a public statement clearing Julian's name. If you do not do exactly as I say, Trayvon will file these code violations, and you will lose everything you have ever built." I looked at the red spray paint dripping down the brick. I looked at the demolition sticker on the support beam. I looked at Trayvon, who was sweating profusely under his hard hat, gripping the clipboard so hard his knuckles were white. I did not argue. I did not yell for security. I did not show a single ounce of panic. I simply stood my ground perfectly relaxed and let the silence stretch until Vivica's triumphant smile began to twitch with uncertainty. Trevon. I said, my voice smooth and conversational. Do you know what makes restoring historic armories so incredibly difficult? Trevon blinked, looking at Vivica for help. The structural integrity, he mumbled, reciting the phrase he had clearly memorized in the car ride over. No, I corrected gently. It is the integration of modern security technology into century-old architecture without compromising the historic aesthetic. I raised my hand and pointed toward the high ceilings. Look directly above you at the original crown molding tracing the eastern archway. Then look at the vintage iron ventilation grates set into the southern wall. Vivica and Trevin both looked up. Nestled perfectly within the intricate plasterwork and hidden behind the iron grates were small, high-definition security lenses. They were completely invisible to the naked eye unless you knew exactly where to search. My sights are equipped with military-grade surveillance, I explained, taking a slow step toward them. 360-degree coverage complete with audio recording and motion sensors. It deters vandalism and theft. It also captures absolutely everything that happens on the property boundaries, including the south parking lot. Trevon took a step back, his clipboard slipping from his sweaty grip and clattering onto the concrete floor. You see, Vivica, I continued, my voice dropping to a chilling absolute certainty. I knew Julian and Chloe lacked the patience to wage a long digital war. I knew their egos would demand immediate physical retaliation. So I made sure my security feeds streamed directly to a secure cloud server in real time. 10 minutes ago, the cameras in the south parking lot recorded Julian Sterling pulling up in his rented Porsche. They recorded him handing Trevon a thick manila envelope stuffed with cash. They recorded him handing Trevon that counterfeit city inspector badge. Vivica's jaw dropped. The color instantly drained from her perfectly contoured face, leaving her looking hollow and terrified. You are bluffing, Vivica whispered, though her voice trembled so violently she could barely form the words. I never bluff, I replied, stepping directly into her personal space. Bribing a city official is a crime. Impersonating a city official to halt a commercial construction project is a felony. Julian thought he was a genius conducting his dirty business outside, completely unaware that he parked directly beneath a 4K resolution security lens. And since Julian decided to make this a corporate attack, I did not just send the footage to the Atlanta Police Department. I smiled, watching the absolute destruction of their extortion plot hit her like a physical blow. I also set up an automatic email forward. I told her, my eyes locked on hers. A crystal-clear video of Julian Sterling orchestrating a felony extortion plot hit Richard Sterling's personal inbox exactly 3 minutes ago. The man Julian is desperate to impress is watching his son commit a federal crime right now. The summons arrived less than 2 hours after Vivica fled the armory. It was a formal, heavily worded email from the executive assistant to Richard Sterling demanding my immediate presence at the Sterling Foundation headquarters in Buckhead. There was no stated agenda, no list of attendees, and no room for negotiation. It was a royal decree wrapped in corporate letterhead. I arrived early and was escorted into the primary boardroom. The space was designed to intimidate, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, dark mahogany paneling, and a massive polished conference table that stretched 20 feet across the room. I took my seat at the very far end, placing my hands flat against the cool wood, and waited. Richard Sterling sat at the head of the table, flanked by 4 senior board members. His face was a mask of carved granite. He did not offer a greeting when I entered, nor did he acknowledge me as the heavy double doors swung open a few minutes later to admit my family. They walked in like conquering royalty. Julian strutted through the doors first, his chest puffed out, radiating the kind of bulletproof arrogance that only comes from generational wealth and severe delusion. He clearly believed I had been bluffing about the security cameras. In his mind, I was just a desperate contractor trying to save a failing project, and he was the untouchable heir to the Sterling empire. Chloe clung tightly to his arm, dressed in a pristine white designer suit, playing the role of the beleaguered but resilient future wife. Right behind them came Vivica and Carlton. The sheer, unadulterated smugness radiating from my parents was almost blinding. Vivica had completely recovered from her panic attack at the construction site. She carried her designer handbag like a trophy, her chin tilted upward, a small victorious smirk playing on her lips. Carlton walked with the heavy, self-important stride of a patriarch who was finally about to see his rebellious daughter put in her place. They fully expected this meeting to be my execution. They believed the viral social media videos had worked. They assumed the Sterling board was terrified of the public backlash, horrified by the fabricated elder abuse allegations, and completely ready to strip Heritage Restoration Group of our $10 million contract. Julian did not even wait to be offered a seat. He walked straight to the center of the table and slammed a thick leather-bound dossier down onto the mahogany surface. The sound echoed sharply in the quiet room. "Gentlemen!" Julian began, his voice booming with practiced corporate authority. He looked at his father, then at the board members, completely ignoring my presence at the end of the table. "I called this emergency intervention because the Sterling Foundation is currently tied to a massive public relations liability. The woman sitting at the end of this table is actively defrauding my future family." He tapped the leather dossier aggressively. "In this file you will find statements, social media analytics, and character testimonies proving that Zora has engaged in systematic financial manipulation. She manipulated her dying grandmother into signing over historical assets. She has unlawfully evicted her own parents to line her corporate pockets. The internet is currently tearing her reputation apart, and if we do not publicly sever our $10 million restoration contract with her firm today, the Sterling name will be dragged down into the mud with her. We have morality clauses in our vendor agreements for exactly this reason." Richard Sterling rested his chin on his steepled fingers. His sharp, calculating eyes flicked from the dossier to Julian, and then finally settled on me. He did not say a word. Chloe sniffled softly on cue, dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue. Julian wrapped a protective arm around her waist, playing the valiant defender. To make matters worse, Julian continued, lowering his voice into a tone of grave concern. "We have reason to believe that Zora is not entirely stable. I know it is difficult to hear, but her own family is willing to testify to her deeply concerning history. Carlton, if you would." Carlton straightened his jacket and stepped forward. He placed his hands on the back of a leather executive chair, looking around the room with the weary, heavy expression of a heartbroken father. It was an Oscar-worthy performance. "This is the hardest thing a father ever has to do," Carlton said, his voice thick with manufactured grief. "To stand in a room like this and admit that your own flesh and blood is deeply unwell. But I have to protect my family, and I have to protect the Sterling legacy. Zora has been unstable for years." Vivica nodded solemnly beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "It started when she dropped out of college," Carlton explained, looking directly at Richard Sterling to ensure the billionaire was absorbing every word. "She simply could not handle the pressure. While Chloe was excelling, going to medical school and building a flawless life, Zora completely fell apart. She became a pathological liar. She developed this obsessive, jealous fixation on her sister. Everything she has done since starting this construction company has been a desperate attempt to tear down the people who actually supported her." Carlton let out a long, heavy sigh, shaking his head. "She has woven this massive web of lies to steal her grandmother's estate, just to punish us for her own failures. She is vindictive. She is unwell. And as her father, it breaks my heart to say that you cannot trust a single word that comes out of her mouth. She will say anything to save her firm. She will probably sit here right now and invent wild conspiracy theories about us just to deflect from her own crimes. For the sake of your foundation, Richard, you need to cut ties with her immediately before her delusions cause permanent damage to your brand." Carlton stepped back, lowering his head as if overcome by the tragedy of his own testimony. Vivica rubbed his arm consolingly. Chloe leaned her head against Julian's shoulder. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a united front of victims perfectly framed against the backdrop of my supposed villainy. They had laid out their trap flawlessly. They had painted me as a jealous, unstable dropout throwing a corporate tantrum, preemptively discrediting anything I might say to defend myself. I did not interrupt them. I did not raise my voice, defend my college record, or scream about the blatant, suffocating lies echoing off the mahogany walls. I simply sat in my chair at the far end of the long table, my posture perfectly relaxed, my hands folded neatly in front of me. I looked at the smug satisfaction practically vibrating off Julian's face. I looked at my father, who had just tried to assassinate my character and destroy my livelihood to protect his own fake high society image. I sat in absolute silence, holding Richard Sterling's gaze down the length of the table, waiting for the billionaire patriarch to respond to his son's magnificent performance. I held Richard Sterling's gaze down the length of the polished mahogany table. Julian was still standing, his chest puffed out, waiting for his father to deliver the killing blow to my career. Carlton and Vivica wore matching expressions of cruel anticipation. They had played their cards. They had delivered their flawless performance of victimhood. Now they were simply waiting for the guillotine to drop on my neck. Richard did not look at the fabricated leather dossier. He did not look at my parents. He slowly lowered his steepled fingers and picked up a sleek silver remote control resting beside his coffee cup. He aimed it at the far wall and pressed a single button. The motorized blinds hummed as they descended, plunging the room into heavy shadows. A massive ceiling-to-floor digital projector screen rolled down from the ceiling. Julian blinked, stepping back from the table, his confident posture faltering for the first time. The screen flickered to life in crystal-clear 4K resolution. There was no mistaking the location. It was the south parking lot of the Auburn Avenue Armory. The timestamp in the corner flashed yesterday's date. The board members leaned forward in their leather chairs. On screen, Julian's rented Porsche Panamera slid into a parking space. Trayvon walked into the frame wearing his oversized neon yellow vest and an uncomfortable, nervous expression. The audio was flawless. The boardroom speakers amplified Julian's voice with terrifying clarity as he handed Trayvon a thick manila envelope and a counterfeit city inspector badge. "I want her shut down by noon," the digital Julian commanded, sounding like a cheap imitation of a mafia boss. "Make it look official. Tag every load-bearing wall you can find. I do not care what you have to break or what you have to condemn. Just make sure the fine is large enough to bankrupt her firm by the end of the week." The physical Julian made a sound like he was choking on a golf ball. His face drained of all color, shifting from a confident bronze to a sickly pale gray. Vivica clutched the edge of the mahogany table, her manicured nails digging into the wood as she watched her nephew accept the cash bribe. Carlton's jaw went slack, his entire body deflating like a punctured tire. The senior board members erupted in a chorus of appalled whispers, furiously taking notes and glaring at Julian with naked disgust. Richard pressed the button a second time. The parking lot video vanished, replaced by a still image of the Sterling Estate courtyard from the night of the engagement party. An audio file began to play. The sound enhancement was impeccable. It picked up the clinking of champagne glasses, the distant string quartet, and the unmistakable shrill pitch of my sister's voice. "Of course I took her blueprints." Chloe's voice echoed through the executive boardroom, dripping with unearned arrogance. "Zora is a workaholic loser. She had an entire portfolio just sitting on her desk. I swapped the title pages, submitted it to the review board, and secured my fellowship. It is not stealing if she was too stupid to lock her office. Besides, my professors love the designs. I am the one who sold them to the committee. She would have never had the social grace to present them properly anyway." Chloe let out a strangled gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. She looked around wildly, shaking her head as the board members turned their furious stares onto her. "That is edited," she cried out, her voice trembling. "That is deep-faked. I never said that. She is trying to frame me. Zora is insane." One of the senior board members, a woman in a sharp navy suit, slammed her hand flat against the table. "You are insulting our intelligence, young lady," the board member snapped. "We employ the best forensic security analysts in the country. This footage and audio were verified before you even stepped into this building. You are a fraud." Richard Sterling finally stood up. The ambient noise in the room instantly died. He did not look at my parents. He did not even look at Chloe. He fixed his cold, unyielding stare entirely on his son. "You brought a counterfeit city inspector onto a commercial property." Richard said, his voice deadly quiet. completely devoid of any paternal warmth. You orchestrated a felony extortion plot against a federal contractor. You handed over a cash bribe in broad daylight, under a high-definition security camera, and then you walked into my boardroom and handed me a fabricated dossier to try and cover your tracks. Julian took a step forward, raising his hands in a desperate plea. Dad, please listen to me. They manipulated me. Vivica and Carlton said she was stealing from them. I was trying to protect our investments. I was trying to protect the family legacy. You are a liability. Richard interrupted, his tone slicing through Julian's excuses like a scalpel. You have brought criminal exposure to the Sterling Foundation. You have brought a family of desperate, fraudulent social climbers into my home, and you have proven that you possess absolutely zero business acumen. Richard turned to the board secretary, who was typing furiously on her laptop. Strike his name from all accounts. Julian froze. Strike what? You are officially removed from the Sterling Family Trust, Richard declared, buttoning his suit jacket. As of this exact moment, you have no equity in this firm. Your corporate credit cards are suspended. Your access to the estate portfolios is revoked. You are entirely disinherited. You have brought shame to my name, Julian, and I will not allow you to bankrupt my legacy with your profound stupidity. You are on your own. The reality of the words crashed over the room like an anvil. Vivica let out a sharp, horrified squeak. Carlton gripped the back of his chair so hard it looked like the wood might splinter. They had just lost their multi-million-dollar safety net. The generational wealth they had sacrificed my sanity to secure was gone forever. Julian stood completely paralyzed, his breathing shallow and erratic. He looked at his father's retreating back as Richard walked out of the boardroom without a second glance. Then Julian slowly turned his head to look at Chloe. The protective, loving facade he had maintained for the past year evaporated in a split second. His eyes darkened with absolute unhinged rage. Realizing he was now completely broke, disinherited, and facing federal bribery charges, he stepped toward my sister, his hands balling into tight fists. Julian lunged forward and grabbed Chloe by the shoulders, his fingers digging so harshly into her pristine white blazer that she let out a sharp cry of pain. The polished, charismatic air of the Sterling Empire vanished entirely. In his place stood a frantic, sweating coward who had just watched his entire safety net burn to ash. Fix this right now, Julian spat, giving her a violent shake. You call your bank, you call your broker, you liquidate whatever is left in that grandmother's trust of yours today. I need $800,000 wired into my offshore account by midnight, or the people I owe are going to break my legs. Chloe stared at him, her eyes wide with genuine, unadulterated terror. She tried to pull away, but he tightened his grip. Julian, you are hurting me, she gasped, tears spilling over her mascara. What are you talking about? What offshore account? What people? My bookies, you stupid girl! He roared, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls of the boardroom. The board members, who were still packing their briefcases, froze in their tracks, watching the spectacular implosion of their former golden boy. I owe $2 million to a sports betting syndicate in Macau. Julian confessed, his chest heaving. My father was covering the interest payments through a shell company to protect the foundation's stock price. Now that he cut me off, the syndicate will come to collect the principal. I am dead, Chloe. I am completely dead, unless you empty your family accounts right now. Chloe shook her head frantically, struggling against his grip. But you love me, she choked out. We are getting married. We are building a life together. You cannot just demand my family's money to pay off illegal gambling debts. Julian let out a sharp, barking laugh that held absolutely no humor. It was a cold, cruel sound. You actually believed the romance act, he sneered, leaning in so close his breath ruffled her hair. My father gave me an ultimatum last year. He told me to clean up my public image or lose my seat on the board. You were nothing but a PR strategy, Chloe. You were the wholesome, upper-class future doctor shield I needed to hide my vices. I only proposed to you because Carlton promised me your family trust fund would provide a fresh injection of capital into my private accounts. If you do not have the cash to save me today, you are completely useless to me. He shoved her backward. Chloe stumbled, her heel catching on the thick boardroom carpet, and she collapsed into one of the heavy leather chairs, sobbing into her hands. Vivica rushed forward, her face completely pale. The social standing she had worshipped her entire life was disintegrating right in front of her. She could not lose a sterling son-in-law. She could not handle the public humiliation of a cancelled high society wedding. Desperation made her reckless. "Julian, wait!" Vivica pleaded, holding up her hands like she was trying to calm a wild animal. "Do not do this. We can fix it. We can pay the syndicate. We have the assets to cover your debts right now." She turned to her designer handbag sitting on the table and ripped it open, tearing through her belongings until she pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. I recognized the binding immediately. It was the commercial property portfolio for Heritage Holdings. "Carlton has power of attorney," Vivica babbled, waving the documents frantically toward Julian. "We have full control over the downtown restoration sites. Zora's company is worth at least $5 million. We will sign the transfer authorizations over to you right now. You can liquidate the Auburn Avenue project. You can sell the brownstone. Just take the deeds and pay your bookies. Please, Julian, do not walk away from this family." I stood up from my chair at the far end of the long conference table. My footsteps were completely silent on the thick carpet as I walked the length of the room. Vivica was so consumed by her panic that she did not even register my presence until I reached out and calmly plucked the stack of legal documents right out of her trembling hands. "You cannot sign over a company you do not own." "Mother," I said, keeping my voice perfectly even. Vivica whirled around, her eyes wild with panic and fury. "Give those back to me, Zora. I am trying to save your sister's future. You are going to sign those properties over to Julian today, or I will have Carlton freeze every single bank account associated with your name." I looked down at the counterfeit transfer authorizations she had drafted. She had genuinely believed she could walk into a corporate boardroom and illegally sign away my livelihood to cover up a gambling debt. "You do not have the authority to freeze anything," I replied, tossing the useless documents into the center of the table. "You never did. The blind trust was sealed independently by my legal team 3 years ago. Carlton's name is not on a single ledger. You have been bluffing for months, hoping I would be too intimidated to check the actual financial records. But I am not intimidated, Vivica, and I always check the records." I picked up the silver remote control that Richard Sterling had left on the table. I aimed it at the digital projector suspended from the ceiling and pressed the activation button. The screen flashed, replacing the frozen security footage of Julian's bribery with a highly detailed, comprehensive financial spreadsheet. It was incredibly thorough. Carlton looked up at the screen. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He took a staggering step backward, grabbing the edge of the table for support. "Let us clear up this delusion about a family trust fund," I announced, my voice carrying clearly to every remaining board member in the room. "What you are looking at is the absolute unedited financial reality of Carlton and Vivica's estate." I pointed a laser pen at the top row of red numbers. "Here is the second mortgage they secretly took out on the suburban estate to pay for Chloe's luxury wedding venue deposit. Below that are the 4 separate credit lines Vivica maxed out to maintain her country club memberships and designer wardrobe. And right here at the very bottom is the high-interest bridge loan Carlton secured last month just to keep their cars from being repossessed." Julian turned slowly to look at the screen. His eyes traced the columns of devastating debt. The total liability figure at the bottom corner of the spreadsheet pulsed in bright red ink. -$2 million. I lowered the remote and looked directly at Julian, then at my mother, whose mouth was opening and closing without producing a single sound. "There is no trust fund for Chloe," I stated, the cold, hard truth echoing in the silent boardroom. "There are no hidden assets. There is no bailout money for your gambling debts, Julian. They have been lying to you just as much as they have been lying to the public. They cannot save your life because they do not have a single dime to their name. You are entirely bankrupt." Julian never got the chance to swing. 2 of Richard Sterling's private security guards stepped out from the shadows of the boardroom, gripping Julian by the arms and dragging him backward. He thrashed, kicking the heavy wooden table and screaming obscenities as they hauled him out through the double doors. He was tossed out of the building, leaving Chloe trembling in her chair, and my parents staring in dead silence at the projected evidence of their total financial ruin. 6 hours later, the devastating reality of that red ink had completely reshaped the social landscape of Atlanta. What was originally scheduled to be the most photographed, extensively catered wedding rehearsal dinner of the decade had been quietly and ruthlessly erased from existence. In its place, Richard Sterling had simply accelerated the timeline for the Sterling Foundation annual gala, moving the massive philanthropic event to the grand ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel. I did not arrive through the service elevator. I did not arrive wearing a hard hat, carrying a clipboard, or holding a bucket of industrial floor cleaner. I arrived in a floor-length emerald silk gown, stepping out of a black town car, as Richard Sterling's personal VIP guest of honor. The press line surrounding the velvet ropes practically vibrated with aggressive curiosity. Rumors of Julian's spectacular fall from grace and the abruptly canceled high society wedding had already begun to leak into the city's social stratosphere, but the official narrative remained tightly controlled. Richard stood beside me, personally introducing me to state senators, venture capitalists, and the elite architects of the city. He did not introduce me as a contractor. He introduced me as his primary partner in the Downtown Revitalization Initiative. The ballroom was a masterpiece of cascading orchids, crystal chandeliers, and flowing champagne. I was standing near the center of the room discussing the structural integrity of reclaimed brick with a major real estate developer when a sudden ripple of absolute shock swept through the crowd. The sea of tailored tuxedos and designer gowns parted. Vivica, Carlton, and Chloe marched into the ballroom. They had not been invited. Their names were not on the guest list, and their access credentials had been permanently revoked. But Vivica had spent 30 years learning how to bypass security and manipulate host stands, and sheer blinding desperation had made her fearless. Chloe was actually wearing the white pearl-encrusted dress she had purchased for the canceled rehearsal dinner. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, but her chin was thrust aggressively forward in a desperate attempt to salvage her dignity. Carlton wore a stiff tuxedo, sweating profusely under the bright lights, looking around the room with wide, panicked eyes. Vivica led the charge. She was flashing a terrifying manic smile that showed all of her teeth. They had lost their $2 million bluff. They had lost Julian. They had lost the wedding, and they were weeks away from losing their mansion to the bank. They had realized in the span of a single afternoon that their only remaining lifeline to wealth in high society was the daughter they had spent a decade trying to destroy. Vivica spotted me standing with the developers. She practically sprinted across the polished floor, dragging Carlton and Chloe behind her like props. Zora, my darling Vivica, projected her voice engineered to carry over the ambient jazz music. She threw her arms wide, attempting to pull me into a suffocating maternal embrace for the benefit of the watching cameras. I took a single deliberate step backward, leaving her grasping at empty air. Vivica did not miss a beat. She seamlessly transitioned her failed hug into a broad gesture of overwhelming pride, turning to face the confused circle of property developers. "Is she not absolutely incredible?" Vivica gushed, placing a hand over her heart and beaming at me. "We have kept her extraordinary success under wraps for so long, but tonight we can finally celebrate as a family. Carlton and I are just bursting with pride." A local society news crew, tipped off to the underlying drama, had been conducting interviews near the main stage. The reporter noticed the commotion and approached our group, extending a microphone to capture the interaction. Vivica saw the red recording light blink on the camera, and her eyes dilated with greedy, immediate opportunity. Before the reporter could even formulate a question, Vivica reached out, wrapped both of her hands around the microphone, and pulled it directly toward her face. "This entire project," Vivica announced to the cameras, her voice echoing through the surrounding audio speakers, "is a testament to the power of family. People have wondered why we were so hard on Zora, why we pushed her, why we forced her to stand on her own 2 feet after college." She paused, looking around the room with a fabricated look of deep maternal wisdom. "It was tough love. We knew she possessed this extraordinary brilliance, but she needed to be tested. Carlton and I orchestrated this entire journey. We gave her the foundation to build Heritage Restoration Group because we knew she would rise to the occasion. We knew she needed to struggle to find her true potential. Every obstacle she faced was a lesson we carefully designed to forge her into the absolute powerhouse she is tonight. We could not be prouder to share in this triumph with our brilliant daughter. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. She was attempting to rewrite 30 years of emotional abuse, neglect, and financial sabotage into a masterclass on strategic parenting. She wanted to staple her name to my empire, claim credit for my survival, and ride my coattails straight back to the top of the social ladder. I stood perfectly still, letting her dig her grave deeper with every delusional word. The crowd of elites stared in a mixture of fascination and severe discomfort as Vivica continued her monologue, gripping the microphone like a life raft. Then the heavy, measured sound of footsteps echoed from the elevated stage directly behind the press crew. Richard Sterling walked up to the central podium, his face an unreadable mask of absolute authority. He looked down at Vivica, entirely unamused by her theatrical performance. He reached out to the master audio console resting on the podium, placed his finger on the main switch, and cut the microphone feed. The sharp, high-pitched squeal of audio feedback pierced the ballroom as the microphone died. Vivica tapped the metal grill frantically, her manic smile faltering as the heavy silence of the St. Regis Grand Ballroom crashed down around her. Richard Sterling did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply reached out and pulled the dead microphone from her rigid grip. Security personnel in tailored black suits materialized from the shadows of the floral arrangements, forming a quiet, impenetrable wall behind my parents and sister. They were not dragged out immediately. Richard wanted them to stay. He wanted them to witness every single second of the reality they had tried so desperately to rewrite. "Thank you for that unsolicited fiction," Richard said, his voice echoing perfectly through the secondary lapel microphone clipped to his tuxedo. He did not look at Vivica. He looked out at the sea of state senators, investors, and journalists. The Sterling Foundation does not partner with delusions. We partner with visionaries. And tonight we are here to correct a gross miscarriage of justice that has gone unaddressed for far too long. Vivica shrank back, bumping into Carlton, who was sweating so profusely his stiff collar was beginning to wilt. Chloe stood frozen, her knuckles turning white as she clutched her sequined clutch. 3 years ago, Richard continued, stepping away from the podium and walking directly toward me. An extraordinary portfolio of architectural blueprints was submitted to the National Review Board. These designs outlined a revolutionary method for preserving historical load-bearing structures while retrofitting them for modern sustainable energy. They were brilliant, they were unparalleled, and they won the highest honor our industry can bestow. Richard signaled to an assistant standing near the edge of the stage. The assistant stepped forward, carrying a polished mahogany box lined with crushed black velvet. Resting in the center was a heavy, gleaming gold medallion attached to a thick navy ribbon. I felt a sudden sharp tightness in my chest. I knew exactly what that was. I had spent countless sleepless nights staring at the application requirements for it, back when I was working out of a cramped studio apartment, living on instant noodles, pouring my soul into those Auburn Avenue blueprints. For 3 years, Richard announced, his voice slicing through the silent ballroom. Like a blade, the National Heritage Preservation Medal has been credited to the wrong person. It was claimed by an individual who stole the portfolio from her own sister's desk. She submitted it under her own name, used the prestige of this exact medal to secure a highly competitive medical fellowship, and built her entire professional foundation on a stolen identity. The gasps from the high society crowd were audible. Whispers erupted among the tables. Journalists raised their cameras, the rapid flashes illuminating Chloe's rapidly paling face. She took a step backward, shaking her head, but the security guards stood firm behind her, blocking any chance of retreat. "We recently employed a team of digital forensic analysts to review the original structural files," Richard stated, his eyes locking onto Chloe. "The metadata, the time-stamped keystrokes, and the original encrypted copyright signatures all point to one single author." Richard turned to me, his expression softening into genuine, profound respect. He lifted the heavy gold medal from the velvet box. "Zora," he said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "You survived betrayal. You survived sabotage. You built an empire with your own 2 hands, while the people who should have protected you tried to tear you down. It is my absolute honor to finally present you with the National Heritage Preservation Medal. You earned this. You always owned this. The ballroom erupted into a deafening roar of applause. The developers I had just been speaking with raised their champagne glasses. Flashbulbs blinded me as Richard stepped forward and placed the heavy ribbon around my neck. The gold medallion rested against my emerald silk gown, a physical, undeniable weight of vindication. I looked past Richard straight at my sister. Chloe's pristine, pearl-encrusted facade shattered completely. Her chest heaved. Her hands shook violently. The applause was deafening, but it was not for her. The spotlight she had stolen, the golden child narrative she had weaponized against me her entire life, was gone. "That is a lie!" Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking as she lunged forward. The music and applause died down as she pointed a trembling finger at me. "I earned my fellowship. I am a doctor. You cannot do this to me. You are trying to ruin my life because you have always been jealous of me." She looked wildly around the room, making eye contact with the press, desperately trying to find a sympathetic face. "I am a board-certified resident," she screamed, her voice echoing in the massive space. "I save lives. She just cleans old buildings. You cannot strip away my achievements over some stupid architectural drawings." Richard Sterling turned to face her, his expression colder than ice. "You are not a doctor," he corrected softly, but the microphone carried every single word. "You are a fraud. Academic theft is a severe violation of the medical board's code of ethics. When the forensic audit confirmed you falsified your residency applications by claiming a national award you stole, the foundation was legally obligated to report the discrepancy." Chloe froze, her mouth hanging open. Carlton let out a strangled groan, burying his face in his hands. Vivica looked like she was going to be physically sick, backing away from her favorite daughter, as if Chloe had suddenly caught a contagious disease. The medical board held an emergency hearing this afternoon. Richard continued, delivering the final fatal blow. "Your medical licenses have been suspended effective immediately, pending a full federal investigation into your fraudulent credentials. You will never practice medicine in this country again." "No." Chloe wailed, a visceral, guttural sound of pure panic. "No, no, no. Mommy, do something. Tell them. Carlton, call our lawyers." But Carlton and Vivica did not move. They had no lawyers. They had no money. They had absolutely nothing left to offer her. Richard gave a subtle nod to the security team. The guards stepped forward, grabbing Chloe firmly by both arms. She thrashed wildly, kicking her expensive heels against the polished floor, her pearl-encrusted dress tearing at the seams as she fought them. "Get your hands off me!" she shrieked, her voice tearing at her throat as they dragged her backward toward the service exit. "I am Chloe. I am the successful one. Zora is crazy. You are all making a mistake. Let me go." Her screams echoed down the long marble hallway, long after the heavy oak doors swung shut, leaving Vivica and Carlton standing entirely alone in the center of the ballroom, completely exposed under the blazing chandeliers. The echo of Chloe's screams faded from the grand ballroom, replaced by the hushed, electrified murmurs of Atlanta's elite. Richard Sterling offered me a respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement that the execution was complete. I touched the heavy gold medallion resting against my collarbone. It was time to leave. I had a multi-million-dollar development project to oversee in the morning. I walked out through the arched mahogany doors and descended the grand sweeping staircase toward the lobby. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass revolving doors, the valet stand was in a state of absolute chaos. Julian was sprinting down the driveway, frantically waving down a yellow taxi that had just dropped off a bewildered guest. He did not look like the polished heir to a billionaire empire. He looked like a hunted animal. Chloe stumbled out of the revolving doors right behind him, clutching the ripped seams of her pearl-encrusted dress. She grabbed Julian's tuxedo jacket, sobbing hysterically, begging him not to leave her alone to face the federal investigators. Julian did not hesitate. He ripped his jacket out of her hands with such violent force that Chloe fell backward onto the wet concrete curb. He dove into the back of the taxi, slamming the door shut. The cab tires screeched against the pavement as it sped off into the rainy Atlanta night. leaving my sister collapsed in a puddle, entirely abandoned by the man she had destroyed my life to secure. I turned away from the glass doors and walked toward the private VIP coat check alcove tucked into the far wing of the lobby. The attendant had stepped away into the back room to retrieve my cashmere wrap. I stood alone in the quiet, dimly lit corridor. Then the heavy velvet curtain behind me was ripped aside. Vivica, Carlton, and Chloe stormed into the narrow space, sealing us off from the rest of the hotel lobby. They looked completely unrecognizable. The immaculate, untouchable facade they had worn for 30 years had been melted off by the scorching heat of truth. Chloe's mascara ran down her face in thick black rivers. Carlton's shoulders were slumped, his chest heaving with panicked, shallow breaths. Vivica's pristine updo had unraveled strands of hair sticking to her tear-stained cheeks. Suddenly, Carlton's knees buckled. My father, the man who had looked at me with nothing but cold disdain my entire life, collapsed onto the marble floor. Vivica followed a second later, throwing herself downward and grabbing the hem of my emerald silk gown. Chloe dropped to her knees beside them, her hands clasped together in a posture of desperate prayer. 3 architects of my misery kneeling at my feet in the shadows of the St. Regis coat check. Zora, please, Vivica sobbed, her voice a ragged, humiliating whine. You have to help us. The bank called Carlton's cell phone 10 minutes ago. Richard tipped them off. They are freezing all the estate accounts right now. They are foreclosing on the house tomorrow morning. We have nowhere to go. We have absolutely nothing left. You have millions in your company accounts. You have the blind trust. Just pay off the bridge loan. Please, Zora. Just pay the $2 million so we do not end up on the streets. Chloe grabbed my wrist, her fingernails digging into my skin. Zora, I need a lawyer. She gasped, her whole body shaking violently. The medical board already sent an email. Federal marshals are going to audit my residency files. I am going to jail. You have Richard Sterling on your side. You have all that power now. Tell him to call off the investigation. Give me the money to leave the state. I will go anywhere. I will disappear. Just write me a check. I looked down at the hands grasping at my clothes. I did not move. I did not flinch. My absolute silence seemed to terrify them even more. Vivica looked up at me, her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic desperation. She tried to pull her ultimate trump card. She tried to weaponize the very concept she had mocked and exploited my entire life. You have to do this, Vivica cried out, her voice echoing off the mirrored walls of the coat check. We are your blood. You cannot turn your back on family. We raised you. We put a roof over your head when you were nothing. You owe us this. You cannot just leave your own flesh and blood to be destroyed. I reached down and slowly, methodically peeled Vivica's fingers off the silk fabric of my gown. I pushed Chloe's hands away from my wrist. I took a deliberate step back, severing all physical contact with them. I looked down at the 3 weeping, broken figures on the marble floor. My heart did not accelerate. I felt no pity. I felt absolutely nothing but chilling, absolute indifference. You threw away your family the day you decided my sanity was an acceptable price to pay for your social climbing, I stated, my voice echoing like a judge delivering a final, irrevocable sentence. You watched me work myself to the bone, scrubbing floors and sleeping in my office while you plotted to steal the very company I built from the ashes of your neglect. You stole my blueprints. You drugged my food. You forged legal documents to rob me blind. Carlton looked up, his face slick with tears. We were just trying to survive, Zora. The business world is brutal. We wanted to protect the family name. You wanted to protect your country club memberships, I snapped, cutting off his pathetic excuse. Do not dare speak to me about blood and loyalty. You used my blood to sign your fraudulent loans. You mocked Big Mama's legacy, calling her a worthless dirt farmer, while you secretly tried to drain the trust she left me. You tried to steal my future to finance your designer wardrobes and luxury cars. You dug this grave with your own unyielding greed, and now you are going to lie in it. I am not giving you a single dime of my fortune, and you will never touch a penny of Big Mama's legacy. You are officially dead to me. The heavy silence that followed my declaration seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the narrow coat check room. The muffled rhythmic bass of the jazz band playing in the grand ballroom felt like it belonged to an entirely different planet. Down here on the cold marble floor, there was only the sound of my mother choking on her own ruined pride. Vivica stared up at me, her tear-streaked face frozen in a mask of absolute disbelief. For 30 years, she had relied on my desperate need for her approval. She had treated me like a stray dog, tossing me scraps of affection only when she needed something in return. She had genuinely believed that no matter how much she abused me, I would always come crawling back. Watching that delusion finally shatter behind her eyes was the most satisfying moment of my entire life. I did not break eye contact as I slowly reached into my emerald-beaded designer clutch. The soft click of the metal clasp sounded as loud as a gunshot in the quiet room. Carlton flinched, pulling his knees tightly to his chest like a frightened child. Chloe whimpered, pressing her face against the heavy wooden counter of the coat-check desk, completely incapable of looking at me. I pulled out a neatly folded stack of crisp white printer paper. I had asked my executive assistant to prepare this exact document yesterday afternoon, right after I finalized the forensic audit of Chloe's medical files. I had anticipated this exact scenario. I knew that once the sterling money vanished, they would try to latch their parasitic claws onto my fortune. I let the documents drop from my fingers. The papers fluttered downward, landing softly right on top of Vivica's trembling knees. The bold black logo of Heritage Restoration Group was printed across the top of the first page. Vivica looked down at the paper. Her hands shook violently as she reached out and picked it up. Her eyes darted back and forth across the text, trying to comprehend what she was holding. It was not a bank draft. It was not a deed to a property. It was not a legal pardon. "What is this?" Vivica sobbed, her voice breaking into a ragged, pathetic gasp. I looked down at her, my posture perfectly straight, my expression entirely devoid of mercy. "It is an application for entry-level floor cleaners at my company," I replied, my voice slicing through the heavy air with chilling precision. "Minimum wage, second shift. You will be scrubbing the historic tiles at the Auburn Avenue properties you tried to steal from me." Vivica let out a sharp, breathless sound, as if I had physically struck her across the face. "You will not get any special treatment," I continued, letting the cold reality of their new life settle over them. "You will have to clock in on time. You will have to wear a uniform. You will be reporting directly to Trayvon, the site manager you tried to bribe. But if you fill that out, I will guarantee you an interview. After all, every family has got one." Chloe let out a sudden, piercing shriek. She slapped her hands over her ears, burying her face in the marble floor, as the reality of minimum wage labor crashed down onto her fragile, pampered ego. She was no longer a prestigious medical fellow. She was an unemployed fraud facing a federal investigation, and her sister had just offered her a mop. Carlton did not say a word. He just stared blankly at the application in Vivica's hands, his entire body deflating. The generational wealth he had sacrificed his soul to protect was gone. The country club memberships, the luxury cars, the tailored suits, all of it was evaporating into thin air. He was a bankrupt old man sitting on the floor of a coat check room. Vivica crumpled the edge of the application in her fist. Her jaw trembled with rage, but she did not throw the paper back at me. She could not throw it back at me. Because deep down, beneath the pride and the panic, she knew that entry-level minimum wage was the only lifeline they had left. They needed that application. I did not wait for a thank you. I turned my back on them and walked away. I pushed through the heavy velvet curtain and stepped back out into the sprawling, brightly lit lobby of the St. Regis Hotel. The air out here smelled of expensive floral arrangements and fresh rain. I did not look over my shoulder. I walked with steady, echoing footsteps across the polished marble, leaving the architects of my misery entirely behind me. The hotel staff parted respectfully as I approached the main exit. A concierge in a sharp uniform pulled open the heavy glass doors, bowing his head slightly as I passed. "Good evening, Ms. Sterling," he murmured respectfully. I stepped out into the cool, damp Atlanta night. The rain had stopped, leaving the city streets slick and shimmering under the warm glow of the streetlights. The valet attendant immediately spotted me and raised a hand signaling for my driver. A sleek, custom black Maybach glided smoothly up the circular driveway, coming to a halt directly in front of me. The driver stepped out instantly, holding a large black umbrella overhead, just in case a stray drop of water fell from the hotel awning. He opened the heavy rear door, offering me a polite professional nod. I slid into the luxurious leather seat. The cabin of the car was quiet, insulated, and incredibly peaceful. The driver closed the door with a solid, satisfying thud, shutting out the noise of the city completely. "Take me home," I said, leaning my head back against the soft headrest. The car pulled smoothly away from the curb, gliding down the wet asphalt and merging into the glowing stream of downtown traffic. I looked out the tinted window at the towering skyscrapers of Atlanta. Some of those buildings belonged to me now. Many more would belong to me soon. I took a deep, steadying breath. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried in my chest since childhood was completely gone. I did not have to fight for my place at the table anymore. I owned the table. I owned the building the table sat in. I touched the heavy gold National Heritage Preservation Medal resting against the silk of my gown. Big Mama's legacy was safe. The properties she had bled for, the history she had fought to preserve, were protected by an impenetrable fortress of wealth and legal authority. My mother could never touch it. My father could never leverage it. My sister could never steal it. I watched the city lights blur past the window, a genuine, quiet smile finally spreading across my face. My wealth was secured, my legacy was protected, and my absolute freedom was finally achieved. The ultimate lesson from this journey is that your true value is never defined by the people who consistently underestimate you. While betrayal from those closest to you is deeply painful, it can act as the catalyst for discovering your own resilience and building a life of authentic autonomy. True success isn't about gaining their approval. It's about having the courage to set firm boundaries. Protect your peace and thrive on your own terms. Do not let those who failed to nurture your potential determine your limits. You are the architect of your own legacy, and your worth belongs entirely to you. Have you ever had to walk away from those who couldn't see your worth? Share your story in the comments below and hit subscribe for more empowering tales of triumph.